there is a particular kind of silence that unsettles even the most seasoned investigator. The silence of an aircraft that never arrives. Airports are places of motion, of engines rumbling, of families reuniting, of schedules kept and broken. Yet when a plane disappears, leaving behind only unanswered radios and the ticking of clocks in control towers, that silence becomes unbearable. It is not the noise of a crash site where wreckage speaks in twisted metal and scorched ground. It is a silence without evidence, without closure, a void that swallows certainty whole. For more than a century, this silence has haunted aviation. Families wait at gates that never see arrivals, governments send search crews that comb oceans and jungles, and investigators chase shadows across the maps of the world. The story of airplane disappearances is not simply about tragedy, it is about the stubborn mystery that refuses to yield to radar, sonar, or satellite. The age of flight began with daring and danger. In the early 20th century, when aviation was still untested, risk was accepted as part of progress. Small aircraft fell prey to weather, mechanical faults, or human error with grim regularity. But even in those fragile years, disappearances that left behind no wreckage stood out. A crash, however terrible, at least provided an answer. A disappearance left only questions, questions multiplied into legends. When Charles Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic in 1927, many feared his name would be added to the roll of those who had vanished into the skies. He did not, but many others did, and their absence set the stage for a century of aviation enigmas. What makes these vanishings so unnerving is that airplanes are not subtle things. They roar, they glimmer in sunlight, they are tracked by instruments, and they carry dozens or hundreds of human lives. For a machine of such size and noise to slip into nothingness defies both common sense and technology. It challenges our belief that the sky is a domain we have mastered. Even now, in an age of satellites that can read a license plate from orbit, planes still vanish. They vanish into oceans, deserts, mountains, jungles, and into that most unforgiving wilderness of all, the unknown. The cases you're about to encounter span the breadth of aviation history, from the pioneering days of fragile wooden biplanes to the sleek modern jets of the 21st century. They are united by one fact: absence. An absence of bodies, of wreckage, of reasons. They are stories that left investigators staring at maps covered in question marks and families staring at empty skies. Some of these cases are famous. The name Amelia Earhart alone carries with it an entire mythos of exploration and disappearance. Others are less known, tucked away in old news reports, their mysteries preserved by distance and time. Yet each of them carries the same haunting weight. A flight plan filed, a takeoff witnessed, and then nothing. When we speak of haunted skies, we are not speaking of phantoms in the literal sense, but of the lingering presence of the unsolved. Investigators who worked the cases of vanished planes often spoke of the feeling that they had been chasing ghosts. Radar blips that vanished mid-sweep, radio calls that ended mid-sentence, emergency signals that flickered and then went dark. These fragments are not enough to solve a case, but they are enough to torment those left behind. A wife who waits at the dock for a plane that never lands, a mother who rereads the last telegram her son sent before boarding, a pilot whose final words were static on the radio, repeated endlessly in official reports but never explained. The first half of the 20th century gave us many of these vanishings, often in the waters of the Atlantic and Pacific. Pilots pushed their machines across vast stretches of ocean with little more than a compass and hope. The margin for error was razor thin, and when error struck, recovery was nearly impossible. Yet even in those dangerous decades, there were flights that vanished under circumstances too strange to be explained away by storm or fuel shortage. Entire passenger aircraft vanished without distress calls in clear weather on well-travelled routes. The wreckage should have been found. It was not. By the mid-20th century, commercial air travel had become safer and the skies more crowded. Navigation improved, radios were stronger, radar began to cover wide regions, and yet disappearances continued. In fact, some of the most unsettling cases occurred precisely because technology was supposed to prevent them. A jetliner tracked by radar one moment, gone the next. A pilot making routine contact with controllers, then falling silent forever. These contradictions, the presence of technology and the persistence of disappearance, are what make the history of aviation vanishing so compelling. They remind us that human mastery of the sky is never absolute. What drives the fascination with these cases is not only the mystery itself, but the human element behind it. Each missing plane carried with it dozens of stories. A soldier returning home, a band leader flying to entertain troops, a family on holiday, a pilot daring to cross an ocean. Their lives intersected in that cabin or cockpit, and then their stories ended in question marks. Investigators write their names into reports, journalists print their photos in newspapers, and families keep their memories alive. But the final chapter is left blank. The blank page is what lingers. As we open this journey into 27 airplane disappearances, think of it as stepping into a vast archive of unanswered questions. Each chapter is a case file, some filled with speculation, some with fragments of evidence, some with nothing at all. Together, they form a gallery of mysteries that still unsettle pilots, investigators, and historians. To this day, governments quietly maintain lists of flights never found, oceans still hold the remains of aircraft undiscovered, and theories still compete in the absence of proof. The story of the vanishing skies is not simply a story of loss, it is also a mirror of our limits. For all the satellites in orbit, for all the sonar scanning the ocean floor, for all the data we collect from engines and instruments, there remain places and moments where technology fails and silence reigns. It is in that silence that the haunting begins. Planes vanish, but the questions they leave behind do not. They remain, waiting, as though the sky itself refuses to give back its secrets. And so we begin with the very first cases of the aviation age, when daring pilots soared into the unknown and sometimes never returned. Their disappearances set the pattern. A flight logged, a destination clear, but an arrival that never came. From those early losses, a century-long mystery unfolds, one that has never stopped growing. In the earliest years of flight, the airplane itself was a fragile experiment. Wooden frames stretched with fabric, engines that rattled and sputtered, wings that flexed in the wind like sails. It was an age of pioneers, men and women who saw the sky as a frontier as raw and untamed as any mountain or ocean. They flew without radar, without weather forecasting, without the invisible nets of technology we now take for granted. And yet, from the very beginning, some of those fragile craft did more than crash, they vanished. Their disappearances marked the first mysteries of the air, and they haunted the world's imagination long before commercial airliners carried families across continents. One of the earliest disappearances came in 1919, when British aviators attempted to make daring crossings of the Atlantic. The First World War had just ended, and pilots were eager to prove that peacetime flight could conquer oceans as easily as battlefields. But in those days, to fly over water meant betting your life on machines that had only just proven themselves reliable for an hour, not for days. A handful succeeded, but others launched into the horizon and were never seen again. Newspapers called them heroes, but their names became cautionary whispers, reminders that the sky could swallow just as surely as the sea. The 1920s saw the boom of long-distance record flights. Adventurers from France, Italy and the United States set their sights on endurance records, crossing deserts and oceans, each flight daring the elements. Among the most famous early vanishings was that of French aviators Charles Nungesser and François Colli in 1927. They took off from Paris in their white biplane, l'Oiseau Blanc, the White Bird, bound for New York. They hoped to be the first to cross the Atlantic non-stop to claim the Orteig Prize that had inspired Charles Lindbergh. But while Lindbergh landed triumphantly in Paris days later, Nungesser and Colli never arrived in America. Witnesses reported hearing an engine sputter near Newfoundland. Others claimed sightings off Maine, but no wreckage was ever confirmed. Their disappearance became one of the great aviation mysteries, and to this day, no trace of the White Bird has been found. In 1928, another name entered the lore of vanished skies, the Australian explorer Charles Kingsford Smith. Attempting a flight from England to Australia, one of his crew members, Charles Ulm, later embarked on his own Pacific journey. Ulm vanished in 1934 while flying a twin-engine airspeed Envoy on a mail flight between Oakland, California and Hawaii. The Pacific is a merciless expanse. One wrong bearing, one sputtering engine, and the sea swallows all evidence. Search ships combed the waters, but Ulm and his companions were never found. His name joined the growing list of pioneers who had charted new routes at the cost of their lives and their answers. These early vanishings shaped public imagination. Newspapers printed dramatic sketches of planes adrift over endless oceans. Families clung to rumours, to hopeful whispers of castaways on islands or ships spotting distress flares at sea, but most of the time, nothing surfaced. The fragility of early aircraft made the possibility of recovery slim. A wooden fuselage striking the water would splinter and sink within minutes. Fuel and oil would disperse in the waves. Even in shallow seas, currents erased clues. The ocean, as it had for centuries with ships, became the perfect accomplice to mystery. Yet the importance of these disappearances lay not only in their tragedy, but in the questions they raised about aviation itself. Could the airplane be trusted to span oceans? Were the skies safe for more than daredevils and record seekers? These questions lingered, and every vanishing brought skepticism alongside wonder. The irony, of course, was that progress marched on in spite of the losses. Lindbergh's success overshadowed Nungesser and Kohler's fate. Airlines began to form routes across Europe, then over the Atlantic. Confidence grew, but the spectre of vanishings never left. It is easy, with modern eyes, to imagine those early disappearances as accidents of primitive technology, and in many cases they likely were. But what unsettled contemporaries, and what still echoes today, was the lack of evidence. Ships sink, leaving debris on the waves. Trains derail, leaving carriages on the ground. But airplanes that vanish into silence challenge something deeper. They vanish from sight, from maps, from memory, leaving behind only the echo of engines fading into the horizon. These early cases established the pattern that would define aviation's most haunting mysteries: a confident departure, the promise of arrival, and then nothing. A logbook entry closed, a family waiting in vain, search crews staring at blank seas and empty skies. The dawn of flight brought triumphs that changed the world, but it also brought mysteries that remain unsolved more than a century later. And as planes grew larger, faster and stronger, the vanishings did not end. In some ways, they only grew more unsettling. From fragile biplanes to passenger airliners, the silence of the vanishing sky endured. And the 1930s would prove it, with one of the most famous disappearances in history, that of Amelia Earhart, whose name became synonymous not just with courage, but with the haunting absence that comes when the world watches a flight take off, but never sees it land. On the morning of July 2nd, 1937, Amelia Earhart and her navigator, Fred Noonan, climbed into their Lockheed Electra in Lae, New Guinea, and pointed the nose toward the wide Pacific. The world followed their progress with fascination. Earhart was no ordinary pilot. She was the most famous aviatrix alive, a record setter who had already crossed the Atlantic, a symbol of courage and modern womanhood. Her goal was nothing less than to circumnavigate the globe, tracing the equator, pushing human flight to its outer limits. But when she lifted off into the humid New Guinea air, no one could have imagined how swiftly triumph would turn to silence. By the time her plane was supposed to reach tiny Howland Island, there was nothing left but unanswered calls and the vast, empty ocean. Her final flight was one of precision and peril. Howland Island, a speck of coral barely 2 miles long, was her target. To land there required flawless navigation across nearly 2,500 miles of open sea. The US Coast Guard cutter Itasca waited offshore, its radios tuned to guide her in. At first, transmissions were faint but present. Then, as the hours passed, the messages became more urgent. Earhart's voice, clipped and strained, carried over the airwaves. "We are running on line north-south." Her last known words, transmitted at 8:43 a.m., spoke of dwindling fuel. After that, silence. The Itasca never saw her. Noonan never spoke again. The disappearance set off one of the largest search operations of its time. American naval ships combed tens of thousands of square miles of ocean, scanning for wreckage, listening for signals, but the Pacific yielded nothing. No floating debris, no bodies, no oil slicks. For a world already enchanted by Earhart's daring career, the lack of evidence magnified the mystery. How could a plane large by the standards of the day vanish so completely within hours of reaching its destination? Theories bloomed as quickly as the grief of her husband, George Putnam, who pressed for answers long after the Navy had ended its official search. The simplest theory is still the most haunting, that her plane ran out of fuel and plunged into the ocean near Howland, sinking swiftly beneath deep waters that concealed all trace. The Pacific there is unforgiving, its floor dropping into dark abysses thousands of feet below. A crash at sea, violent and sudden, would have scattered fragments that currents could sweep away in days, yet for many this explanation was unsatisfying, for it denied any trace of her story's end. Thus, more speculative theories gained traction. Some suggested she and Noonan landed on another island, Gardner Island, now called Nikumaroro, where they may have survived as castaways for a time. In later decades, bones, campfire remains, and scraps of aluminum found their rekindled debate, though none have proven conclusive. Other theories turned darker, weaving Earhart's fame into the shadow of war. Some claimed she was captured by the Japanese after straying toward the Marshall Islands, imprisoned, perhaps executed. Others suggested she was on a secret spy mission, her disappearance covered by the government unwilling to reveal the truth. These stories, fueled by the Cold War suspicion and fragments of rumour, offered intrigue but little evidence. What unites them all is the refusal to accept the void, that someone so visible, so beloved, could vanish into silence without explanation. Amelia Earhart's disappearance became more than a personal tragedy. It was a cultural wound, an unfinished story that still echoes. She represented possibility, the breaking of barriers, the promise that the sky itself could be mastered. To lose her not in battle but in mystery was almost unbearable. She was a symbol of courage, but in death, or in absence, she became something more, a symbol of the unknown. Her empty fate forced the public to confront the truth that even modern heroes could be erased by the vastness of the world. More than 80 years later, expeditions still search the Pacific, sonar mapping the seabed, divers combing reefs, archaeologists sifting sand for fragments of metal or bone. The search has become less about hope and more about closure, yet the allure remains. Each generation returns to the question, where did she fall and why was nothing left behind? Perhaps one day the ocean will yield its secret. Perhaps the silence of that morning will finally break. But until then, Amelia Earhart remains forever airborne in history. Her final flight suspended between ambition and absence, a haunting reminder that the sky does not always give back what it takes. On December 15, 1944, a small UC-64 Norseman aircraft lifted off from an airfield in Bedford, England, its destination Paris. Aboard was Major Glenn Miller, the world-famous bandleader whose swing music had become the heartbeat of an era. Miller was not only a celebrity but a figure of morale, the man whose orchestra kept Allied spirits alive during the darkest days of the Second World War. His disappearance shocked not just his family or his fellow servicemen, but entire nations. One of the most famous musicians of the century had boarded a plane for a routine flight across the English Channel and was never seen again. The weather that morning was poor, though not impossible. Low clouds, freezing temperatures, and patches of fog made flying risky. The UC-64 Norseman was a rugged single-engine aircraft, but it lacked advanced navigation instruments, relying heavily on visual reference. Miller was eager to reach Paris, where his band was scheduled to perform for troops who had liberated the city just months earlier. Despite advice to wait for clearer skies, the flight went ahead. His last known words were casual, remarks about seeing everyone in Paris soon. Less than an hour later, the plane vanished into the mists above the channel. When news of his disappearance reached the United States, it stunned a public already weary of war. Glenn Miller was more than a musician. He was a cultural icon, the soundtrack to countless homes and dances, the embodiment of a hopeful modern America. Headlines carried the shock, Glenn Miller missing. The army launched searches, combing coasts and waters, but no wreckage was ever found. The sea offered no answers, only silence. Families of missing soldiers knew this silence well, but for civilians, the vanishing of a household name like Miller was devastating. If someone so prominent could simply disappear, then the uncertainty of war seemed boundless. Theories soon swirled, each one trying to explain how a simple flight could vanish so completely. The most accepted theory is mechanical failure combined with bad weather. The Norseman, flying low over the frigid channel, may have succumbed to icing on its wings, sending it plunging into the sea. Such an accident would have been swift, merciless, and left little chance of recovery. Yet the absence of wreckage invited speculation. Some believed Miller's plane had been struck by bombs jettisoned from returning Allied aircraft. Pilots coming back from raids over Germany were known to drop unused ordnance into the channel before landing. Could Miller's plane have crossed beneath one such release? A handful of veterans later swore it was possible. Other theories strayed into the conspiratorial. Some whispered that Miller had fallen victim to espionage, captured or killed during a secret mission. Rumours suggested he might have been working as an intermediary in delicate wartime negotiations. None of these tales were supported by evidence, yet they thrived in the vacuum left by official silence. Even decades later, books and documentaries proposed darker possibilities, that he had died in a scandalous incident in Paris, or that governments had covered up the true story. These claims made headlines but offered no closure. The truth, it seemed, had vanished with the Norsemen into the freezing December ski. What remains most haunting about Miller's disappearance is how ordinary the circumstances seemed. This was not a dangerous combat mission. It was a short hop across familiar waters, a journey made countless times by countless aircraft during the war. That a routine transfer could erase one of the world's most recognisable figures underscored the fragility of life in wartime. Soldiers faced constant peril, civilians faced rationing and bombing raids, but Glenn Miller's loss reminded everyone that even fame and influence offered no shield against fate. In the years after, Miller's music took on an even more poignant quality. Songs like In the Mood, Moonlight Serenade, and Chattanooga Choo Choo carried with them not just the joy of swing, but the melancholy of absence. For soldiers returning home, his music was a reminder of the world they had fought for, and of the man who had given them hope even as he himself vanished. His orchestra continued under other leaders, but Miller himself remained suspended in legend, frozen in that moment when his plane lifted off into fog and was never seen again. Searches have continued in modern times, with sonar scans of the channel and renewed studies of wartime records. None have produced definitive proof. The sea holds its secrets tightly, and in the shifting sands of the channel floor, even large wrecks vanish from human reach. Historians lean toward the simple explanation: weather, ice, and bad luck. Yet the allure of mystery persists, for a disappearance without evidence invites endless possibilities. Glenn Miller's fate is not just a wartime footnote, it is a symbol of the strange, merciless power of disappearance, where the absence of answers becomes as enduring as the person themselves. His legacy endures not in wreckage or graves, but in the melodies that outlived him. Every time his music plays, it is accompanied by that silence of 1944, the silence of a plane that took off with a man the world adored and never returned. On the afternoon of December 5th, 1945, 5 US Navy torpedo bombers roared into the skies above Florida. Their mission was routine, a training exercise over the Atlantic. Known as Flight 19, the formation of Grumman TBM Avengers carried 14 airmen, young men accustomed to war but now adjusting to the relative quiet of training runs. The Second World War had ended just months earlier, yet the war's machines still filled the skies and pilots continued their drills. That afternoon, nothing about their assignment suggested history was about to be written. Yet by nightfall, Flight 19 would become one of the most enduring mysteries of aviation, an event that helped give birth to the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. The exercise began as countless others had. The Avengers departed Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale shortly after 2 p.m. Their mission, fly east, then north, practice bombing runs, and finally turn back west to base. At first, radio contact confirmed everything was going according to plan, but soon something strange emerged. Lieutenant Charles Taylor, the flight leader, began reporting confusion with his compass. He claimed his instruments were malfunctioning, that he could not determine his position. Other pilots reported similar problems. Radio operators listened in disbelief as experienced flyers spoke of being hopelessly lost only miles off the coast of Florida. As the hours dragged on, transmissions grew more frantic. "We are not certain of our position," Taylor said. "We can't be sure where we are." The suggestion that multiple compasses had failed simultaneously was deeply unsettling. Weather was worsening, daylight was fading, and fuel was running low. Controllers urged Taylor to fly west, reasoning that any heading in that direction would bring him back to the Florida coast. Instead, he insisted they might be over the Florida Keys and that flying west would carry them into the Gulf of Mexico. Radio operators, unable to convince him otherwise, listened helplessly as the squadron continued into the open Atlantic. At 6:20 p.m, one of the last clear transmissions came through. "All planes close up tight. We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." Minutes later, static replaced voices. Flight 19 was gone, 14 men had vanished. But the night's mystery did not end there. A PBM Mariner rescue aircraft, dispatched to search for them, also disappeared with 13 more crew aboard. Witnesses on a tanker ship reported seeing an explosion in the sky and flames on the water. The search plane was presumed lost in a catastrophic accident, but the Avengers left no such trace. The US Navy launched one of the largest searches in its history. Hundreds of ships and aircraft scoured the Atlantic, from Florida's coastline to the Bahamas. Days passed, but nothing was found. No wreckage, no oil slicks, no floating debris. For planes as large as the Avengers, this was baffling. They were designed for war, built to withstand punishment, and unlikely to disintegrate completely. And yet, it was as though the ocean had swallowed them whole. Official reports concluded the squadron had likely become lost, run out of fuel, and ditched in stormy seas. But the complete absence of physical evidence left room for darker speculation. Flight 19 became one of the cornerstone legends of the Bermuda Triangle. That stretch of ocean between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, blamed for countless disappearances. Books and documentaries claimed compasses spinning wildly, radios failing mysteriously, and skies filled with unnatural phenomena. Some suggested the planes had entered a time warp or had been abducted by forces beyond human understanding. The Navy dismissed such claims, but the allure of mystery was irresistible. Even decades later, Flight 19 is often cited as proof that the Triangle is no ordinary stretch of sea, yet investigators point to simpler explanations. The weather that day was poor, with squalls and heavy seas. The Avengers' compasses may not have failed so much as their pilots became disoriented. Taylor, though experienced at years ago, was unfamiliar with Florida's coastal geography and may have mistaken the shallow waters of the Bahamas for the Gulf. His insistence on his mistaken position led the entire formation farther out to sea. Once fuel ran out, the planes would have ditched in heavy waves. Avengers sink quickly after water landings, their heavy engines pulling them under in minutes. Searchers arriving even hours later would have found little evidence left to recover. Still, doubts remain. Why were no life rafts or bodies ever recovered? How could multiple aircraft flying in formation vanish without even fragments of wreckage? And why did a rescue plane vanish the very same night? Each unanswered question fed the legend, ensuring Flight 19 would never be explained to universal satisfaction. The men themselves became ghosts of history. Young, confident, and trained for war, they had survived combat only to disappear in the peacetime training. Families never received closure, only folded flags and unanswered questions. The sea had taken them, but silence had preserved their story. Newspapers followed the search for weeks, and even today, memorials in Florida honor their sacrifice. Each year, veterans and civilians gather to remember not just the pilots, but the enduring mystery that still clouds their fate. Flight 19 is more than a military training accident. It is a symbol of the limits of human certainty. Instruments can fail, leaders can make errors, weather can turn against even the most skilled pilot. But the absence of evidence creates a space where legend thrives. The Bermuda Triangle might not be cursed, but it is filled with stories like this, tales of machines that should have returned, but never did. And among them, none carries the same weight as the squadron of Avengers that vanished into the Atlantic on that cold December evening, leaving behind nothing but static on the radio and a silence that has never been broken. By the time Flight 19 vanished in 1945, the waters off Florida had already earned a reputation for swallowing ships. The sudden loss of 5 Navy bombers and their rescue plane without a trace seemed to confirm something uncanny about the region. Newspapers dubbed it the Sea of Doom, and in later decades it would become world famous as the Bermuda Triangle, a stretch of ocean forming a rough triangle between Florida, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico. While sailors had long whispered about strange lights, compass errors, and ships lost without warning, the age of aviation gave the mystery new wings. The disappearance of entire aircraft, machines of steel and radar crewed by trained aviators, deepened the sense that this was no ordinary patch of sea. In the late 1940s, commercial aviation was expanding. Families who once relied on steamships were beginning to book flights across the Atlantic. Airliners promised speed and modern comfort, but the promise was undercut when multiple disappearances clustered in the same region that had just consumed Flight 19. In 1948, British South American Airways lost an Avro Tudor airliner called the Star Tiger while approaching Bermuda. A year later, another of their fleet, the Star Ariel, vanished on a similar route. These were large aircraft with dozens of passengers, flying established paths in decent weather, with radio contact moments before they disappeared. Searchers found nothing, For the public, it was as if the triangle had tightened its grip, claiming not only military craft but now civilian lives. What made these vanishings particularly unnerving was their similarity. Both planes radioed routine messages. Neither reported distress, yet neither arrived. Theories ranged from fuel exhaustion to catastrophic failure, but investigators were left empty-handed. No wreckage was ever confirmed. For families waiting at airports, it was as though the planes had flown off the edge of the map. Each unanswered case added weight to the idea that the Bermuda Triangle was not merely dangerous but cursed, an invisible trap where aircraft could vanish as completely as if erased. The legend grew as other cases joined the list. A C-54 Skymaster, a military transport plane, disappeared in 1947 with more than 30 people aboard. A DC-3 vanished in 1948 en route from San Juan to Miami, with 29 souls lost. In each case, investigators recorded last radio contacts, routine reports of position, and then silence. The ocean gave nothing back. The sheer scale of losses in such a concentrated region defied easy explanation, even if logical causes could be proposed one by one. By the 1950s and 1960s, writers began linking these cases into a narrative of mystery. The phrase Bermuda Triangle first appeared in print in the early 1960s and was cemented by a 1964 magazine article that catalogued strange vanishings with ominous flair. Books soon followed, suggesting forces beyond human understanding. Some argued magnetic anomalies disrupted compasses, leading planes astray. Others proposed sudden, violent storms unique to the region. The most sensational theories invoked extraterrestrials, parallel dimensions, or underwater civilizations. These ideas captured the imagination of the public, even if they had little basis in evidence. The triangle became a cultural phenomenon. Documentaries dramatized cockpit radios going silent. Paperbacks lined shelves with covers showing jets plunging into dark seas or glowing discs snatching them away. Pilots, meanwhile, spoke of the real dangers of the region: fast-developing storms, unpredictable currents, and navigational challenges. The waters east of Florida were among the busiest shipping lanes in the world, increasing the chance of accidents. Still, even seasoned aviators admitted that the sheer number of unexplained vanishings left them uneasy. The reality is that the Bermuda Triangle occupies a dangerous part of the globe. The Gulf Stream sweeps through at high speed, capable of carrying wreckage away in hours. Sudden squalls can appear with little warning, reducing visibility to near zero. In the age before satellite weather forecasting, such storms often caught pilots off guard. Compasses can behave strangely in parts of the triangle, where true north and magnetic north align, potentially disorienting navigators. These natural hazards likely account for many losses, yet explanations, however rational, have never fully erased the mystique. For families, rational explanations were cold comfort. A widow waiting in Bermuda for her husband's plane, children searching newspapers for answers. What mattered to them was not whether compasses were confused, but that loved ones never returned. For investigators, the lack of debris was the most confounding aspect. Planes that ditch at sea usually leave floating wreckage. To have so many disappearances leave nothing fed the impression of the triangle as a devourer of evidence. The silence of empty seas became the legend's strongest fuel. Even today, the Bermuda Triangle lingers in the public mind as a place where the ordinary rules do not apply. Airlines still fly its routes daily, thousands of planes crossing its skies each year without incident. But the old mysteries remain unsolved. Somewhere beneath those restless waves lie the remains of Flight 19, the Star Tiger, the Star Ariel, and countless others. The sea has hidden them for decades, and perhaps will for centuries more. The Bermuda Triangle's reputation is not only about vanished aircraft, it is about what those disappearances symbolize. In an age of radar, radios, and satellites, it reminds us that nature can still erase us without explanation. It reminds us that technology does not guarantee safety, that there are places where human mastery falters. Above all, it reminds us of silence, the silence of radios gone dead, the silence of searchers staring across the endless water, the silence that follows when a plane takes off into the sky and never lands. On the evening of January 30th, 1948, a sleek Avro Tudor 4 airliner known as the Star Tiger lifted from the Azores, bound for Bermuda. On board were 25 souls, passengers and crew crossing the Atlantic on a route that should have been uneventful. British South American Airways, already an ambitious post-war carrier, had named its fleet after stars, symbols of guidance across oceans. Yet on this flight, the star would vanish. The Star Tiger never arrived at Bermuda. No distress call, no confirmed wreckage, no survivors, just silence. The journey itself was not reckless. The Tudor was a capable 4-engine aircraft designed for long-distance flights. Its route had been planned with precision. Leave the Azores in the evening, arrive in Bermuda by morning, then continue to its final destination. Weather forecasts, however, were troubling. The crew knew they would face headwinds, low visibility, and possible storms. To compensate, the pilot chose to fly lower than usual, around 2,000 feet above the ocean, believing it safer than battling higher altitude winds. This decision, practical at the time, may have sealed the plane's fate. Flying low reduced fuel burn in headwinds, but left little room for manoeuvre should trouble arise. In the hours that followed, radio operators tracked the Star Tiger across the ocean. Messages came through routinely, positions updated, fuel consumption reported. There was nothing unusual, no signal of distress. By early morning, the plane was nearing Bermuda. Its last transmission was calm, stating simply its estimated arrival time. And then, nothing. The radio went silent. Searchers scoured the seas. American and British aircraft joined the hunt. Ships traced the flight path, but the vast Atlantic, restless and cold, yielded not a single trace. No floating debris, no oil slick, no life jackets. The plane had vanished as completely as if the ocean itself had erased it. Investigators struggled. How could a modern 4-engine aircraft disappear so close to its destination? Some pointed to the low altitude. Flying at 2,000 feet in stormy conditions left the plane vulnerable to sudden downdrafts or mechanical issues. A catastrophic failure could have driven it into the sea before a distress call could be sent. Others considered fuel exhaustion. Fighting headwinds longer than expected, perhaps the tanks had run dry at the worst possible moment. But none of these explanations accounted for the total absence of wreckage. Even in a violent crash, fragments usually surface. Here, the Atlantic gave nothing back. Speculation soon went beyond technical explanations. Some suggested the crew became disoriented, guided off course by faulty navigation instruments. At that low altitude, radar coverage was minimal, and over open sea there were few references. A navigational error could have carried them far from Bermuda, into waters searchers never touched. Others clung to darker theories. Whispers of sabotage emerged. Post-war air travel was still intertwined with politics and espionage. Could the Star Tiger have been downed deliberately? No evidence supported such claims, but the void left behind invited imagination. The disappearance struck particularly hard because it was not an isolated case. Less than a year later, another of the airline's fleet, the Star Ariel, would vanish under similar circumstances, again near Bermuda. Two sister ships lost in the same region seemed more than coincidence. British South American Airways faced intense scrutiny, its reputation collapsing under the weight of unanswered questions. For the public, the message was chilling. Modern airliners could still vanish like the fragile craft of aviation's infancy. The sky had not been tamed after all. For the families of those aboard, grief was compounded by uncertainty. No funerals could be held without bodies, no graves dug without remains. Loved ones lived suspended between hope and despair, replaying the last telegrams, the last words spoken before the flight departed. Newspapers captured their anguish with headlines that emphasized the mystery. Star Tiger fails to arrive, airliner lost without trace. Each report offered updates, but the updates were always the same. Search continues, no wreckage found. The Star Tiger became a cornerstone of the Bermuda Triangle legend. Writers seized on the eerie similarities with other vanishings. A plane flying in good condition, a crew reporting no trouble, and then an abrupt end without explanation. These were the hallmarks of a mystery that transcended ordinary accidents. Theories of magnetic anomalies, sudden storms, or even forces beyond science found fertile ground in the silence. Whether one believed in supernatural explanations or not, the raw facts remained disturbing. A large aircraft had gone missing on a busy transatlantic route, and the ocean had given no clue as to why. In the decades since, searches have been renewed. Historians, divers, and researchers have combed archives and seas alike, hoping to solve the case with modern tools. Sonar scans have charted the ocean floor, records have been re-examined for overlooked clues, yet the Star Tiger remains unfound. Each passing year deepens the sense that the Atlantic has claimed it permanently. The significance of the Star Tiger is not only in its disappearance, but in what it symbolized. It was the post-war era's promise of a new age of global travel, swift, modern, reliable. Its vanishing punctured that promise, reminding the world that the skies still held dangers beyond human control. For every gleaming aircraft that landed safely, there was the shadow of those that did not, those whose passengers boarded confidently only to be erased from history mid-flight. When we look back now, the story of the Star Tiger is more than just another aviation accident. It is a story of the limits of certainty, of how progress can falter against nature's immensity. The Atlantic is a graveyard filled with secrets, and among them the Star Tiger rests, invisible but never forgotten. Its absence lingers like a question in the air, an echo of engines that once droned steadily toward Bermuda but never arrived, and in that silence the reputation of the Bermuda Triangle grew darker, its mysteries amplified by the knowledge that even modern airliners could vanish without a trace. On January 17, 1949, scarcely a year after the disappearance of the Star Tiger, another British South American Airways plane set off from Bermuda bound for Kingston, Jamaica. This aircraft, the Avro Tudor FIV, known as the Star Ariel, carried 20 souls, 7 crew and 13 passengers, on what should have been a routine flight through one of the most heavily travelled regions of the Atlantic. The skies were clear, the weather calm, and the aircraft in good order. No storm clouds gathered on the horizon, yet just like her sister ship before her, the Star Ariel vanished utterly. No wreckage was ever found, no bodies recovered, and no signal of distress was ever confirmed. The eerie parallels between the two losses, so close in time and place, would etch the name of British South American Airways into aviation infamy and deepen the dark mystique of the Bermuda Triangle. The Star Ariel departed Bermuda at 8:41 a.m, climbing into perfect visibility. The radio exchanges with air traffic control were routine at first. The pilot reported cruising altitude, position, and an expected arrival time in Jamaica. Nothing suggested difficulty. Yet a few hours into the journey, silence fell. No further messages were received. Unlike other disappearances where weather or mechanical issues could be suspected, here there was nothing. The day was bright, seas calm, and all systems appeared to be working. Whatever happened to the Star Ariel must have occurred suddenly, leaving no time for distress signals. Search operations began immediately. Naval vessels and aircraft swept the region, repeating the desperate hunt that had followed the loss of the Star Tiger. Thousands of square miles were scanned. Observers watched for oil slicks, floating debris, or any trace of the plane's 20 occupants. Yet again, the Atlantic remained mute. No fragments ever reached the surface. The Tudor had vanished as completely as if it had dissolved into the blue sky itself. For investigators, déjà vu gave way to deep unease. The similarities to the Star Tiger were impossible to ignore. Both were Avro Tudors, both operated by the same airline, both vanished within the same geographic region, and both under relatively manageable conditions. For a public still shaken by the first loss, the second disappearance was intolerable. Questions multiplied. Was there a fatal design flaw in the Tudor aircraft, something that caused sudden catastrophic failure? Or was there truly something hostile in the skies above Bermuda that claimed these aircraft without leaving wreckage behind? Official inquiries sought answers but found little. Investigators suggested the Star Ariel might have suffered a sudden structural failure at high altitude, breaking apart and plunging into deep ocean before a distress call could be made. Others pointed to the possibility of a fire, silencing radios and dooming passengers before they could act. Yet these explanations remained speculative. No evidence existed to confirm them, and the Avro Tudor fleet was soon grounded under a cloud of suspicion. The accidents effectively destroyed British South American Airways' credibility. Within months, the company was absorbed into the newly formed BOAC. Its star fleet remembered more for its vanishings than its successes. For the families of those aboard, the repetition of tragedy was unbearable. Children lost parents, spouses lost partners, and communities lost friends. The absence of wreckage meant that no funerals could be held with certainty, no graves visited. Loved ones were left suspended between grief and disbelief. Newspapers filled columns with speculation, and the mystery soon transcended aviation circles to enter popular imagination. 2 planes, 2 years, 2 disappearances in the same region. This was not coincidence, the public believed, but evidence of something sinister. The loss of the Star Ariel cemented the Bermuda Triangle as a legend. Writers would later seize upon the twin tragedies of the Star Tiger and Star Ariel as central pillars of the triangle mythos. Theories multiplied in decades that followed. Sudden holes in the atmosphere, magnetic fields disrupting instruments, water spouts rising without warning even extraterrestrial involvement. Rational voices pointed instead to human error, flawed technology, or hidden storms. But the truth was that no one knew, and mystery left unsolved grows stronger with time. The name Star Ariel itself seems almost poetic in hindsight, echoing the ethereal and elusive. Ariel, spirit of the air in Shakespeare's The Tempest, vanishing into her element without trace. To many, the disappearance carried symbolic weight, a machine named for a star and a spirit consumed by the very sky it sought to master. Modern efforts have not ended the questions. Oceanographers have noted that the area east of Bermuda is among the deepest in the Atlantic, with trenches dropping miles below the surface. Wreckage from a plane descending there would scatter and sink quickly, almost impossible to detect with mid-20th century search methods. Even with today's sonar, the likelihood of discovery is slim, the costs immense. For researchers, the Star Ariel may forever remain a ghost flight, a reminder that the sea still holds secrets beyond recovery. The disappearance also highlighted a transitional moment in aviation history. The 1940s and 1950s were an era of optimism, with airlines promising glamour and safety to post-war travellers. Yet the reality was harsher. Technology was advancing rapidly, but reliability had not caught up. Aircraft design flaws, limited weather forecasting, and minimal navigation aids left flyers vulnerable. The Star Ariel and Star Tiger represented the price of pushing boundaries too quickly, and their legacy would help drive future safety reforms. Still, for most, what lingers is not the technical analysis, but the silence, the absence of answers. 20 people boarded the Star Ariel on a sunny January morning, expecting to land in Kingston by afternoon. Instead, their flight became a question mark written into history. Families kept waiting for telegrams that never arrived. Searchers stared at seas that gave back nothing. And investigators filled pages of reports with words that said, in essence, we do not know. The Star Ariel joined the gallery of aviation mysteries that haunt the skies. Alongside the Star Tiger, Flight 19 and others, it remains a reminder that even in an age of engines and instruments, disappearance is possible. It stands as one of the defining cases that transformed the Bermuda Triangle from geography into legend. And though decades have passed, the silence of that flight still speaks, echoing across time. An airliner, a clear sky, and a destination never reached. By the close of the 1940s, British South American Airways stood at a crossroads. Born in the optimism of the post-war years, the airline had promised to connect Britain with the far corners of the Atlantic world. Its fleet of Avro Tudor aircraft, christened with celestial names like Star Tiger and Star Ariel, was meant to embody confidence, modernity, and progress. Yet within just 12 months, 2 of those shining symbols had vanished without a trace. The disappearances were not simply accidents, they were disasters that shook the very foundation of the airline. They left behind no wreckage, no survivors, no definitive answers, only the lingering image of a ghost fleet swallowed by the Atlantic. The Tudor aircraft had been designed in haste, developed from bombers that had once thundered through wartime skies. Engineers reimagined them as passenger liners, stretching the fuselage, adding windows and promising comfort where once there had been only weaponry. But the conversion was not without flaws. Pilots privately expressed doubts about the Tudor's performance, particularly its fuel consumption and handling in adverse conditions. In the hands of British South American Airways, the planes were tasked with long overwater flights, routes that demanded reliability. The disappearances of the Star Tiger in 1948 and the Star Ariel in 1949 exposed those weaknesses in the most dramatic fashion possible. The losses struck not only the airline but the British public. Post-war Britain had staked pride in rebuilding its aviation industry, eager to rival American giants like Pan Am. Yet now, the nation's flagship carrier was making headlines for planes that never arrived. Families mourned, newspapers speculated, and trust evaporated. Travellers hesitated to board Tudor aircraft. Politicians questioned whether the fleet was cursed or at the very least fatally flawed. Inquiries were convened, as they always were after accidents, but they yielded little satisfaction. The investigations into both vanishings concluded with maddening vagueness: probable navigational errors, possible weather complications, potential mechanical failures. Each report listed possibilities but no certainties. For the Star Tiger, low altitude and stormy conditions might have played a role. For the Star Ariel, the weather was fine, which made the lack of answers even more damning. The absence of wreckage meant there was no evidence to test, no instruments to examine, no bodies to autopsy. The official verdict, repeated in careful bureaucratic prose, amounted to the same haunting refrain: the cause cannot be determined. The press seized on the mystery. Headlines invoked the Bermuda Triangle, even before the term was popularized, as if geography itself conspired against the fleet. Rumors swirled of sabotage cloaked in Cold War secrecy, of navigational instruments compromised by forces unknown. Some speculated that the Tudors were fundamentally unsafe, prone to sudden structural failure. Others whispered of supernatural causes, of skies that swallowed planes as seas once swallowed ships. For families desperate for closure, these stories filled the silence left by the ocean's refusal to return answers. Inside the airline, morale collapsed. Crews spoke uneasily of flying ghost ships, planes whose sistercraft had simply vanished into the blue. Each takeoff carried with it not just the usual risks of aviation, but the shadow of the disappearances. The company's reputation plummeted, bookings dwindled, and within months, British South American Airways was folded into the larger BOAC, absorbed more to bury its failures than to expand its routes. The Starfleet, once meant to symbolize celestial guidance, became instead a graveyard of names written into the history of mystery. What makes the story of BSAA's Ghost Fleet particularly haunting is how ordinary it should have been. These were not experimental flights pushing the limits of aviation. They were scheduled services, carrying businessmen, holidaymakers, and crew who expected to land as routinely as trains pulled into stations. The fact that they vanished in an era already equipped with radios, weather stations, and established routes made their absence all the more chilling. These were not fragile biplanes of the early 20th century, but modern airliners of steel and engines, machines that should have left behind evidence of their fate. Historians and researchers have revisited the cases for decades, each time circling back to the same central puzzle. The ocean gave nothing. In the modern age of sonar and satellite imaging, some have argued that renewed searches could yet uncover wreckage. But the Atlantic in those regions is vast and deep, with trenches that conceal secrets miles beneath the surface. Even if the planes rest there, they may be beyond recovery. And so the legend persists. 2 sister ships, 25 lives in one, 20 in the other, erased almost identically within a year. For aviation, the disappearances were a lesson written in absence. They highlighted the need for stricter maintenance oversight, for better communication equipment, and for international cooperation in search and rescue. But for the wider public, they became something else entirely. Symbols of the uncanny, stories whispered whenever planes flew over dark seas. The names Star Tiger and Star Ariel live on not as milestones of progress, but as warnings of fragility. Today, when travellers cross the Atlantic in jetliners tracked by satellites, guided by precise navigation, and monitored from takeoff to landing, it is tempting to believe that such mysteries belong to the past. Yet the tale of BSAA's Ghost Fleet remains relevant. It reminds us that certainty is never absolute, that the ocean and sky can still claim what they wish, and that sometimes even the most advanced machines of their age can vanish into silence. For the families left behind, for the airline that collapsed under the weight of its losses, and for the investigators who signed reports filled with unanswered questions, the Ghost Fleet of the late 1940s remains one of aviation's most haunting chapters. And though the company is gone, and the Tudors long scrapped, the story of the Star Tiger and Star Ariel continues to drift like phantom signals over the Atlantic, echoes of engines lost to time, reminders that the sky does not always give back what it takes. On March 16, 1962, Flying Tiger Line Flight 739 lifted off from Guam, bound for the Philippines, carrying 93 US Army soldiers and 11 crew members. The chartered Lockheed Super Constellation was one of many military transport flights moving men and equipment across the Pacific during the height of Cold War tensions in Southeast Asia. For the soldiers aboard, it was another step in a long journey. For the airline, it was a routine mission. but over the vast expanse of ocean the plane vanished. Not a single piece of wreckage was recovered, not a single body retrieved. 99 lives disappeared into the Pacific, leaving behind a mystery that has endured for over 60 years. The Super Constellation was no experimental aircraft. It was a workhorse of its era, a graceful triple-tailed plane with long, elegant wings, widely used for both commercial and military transport. Flight 739's crew was experienced, its route well established. Weather conditions on the night of the disappearance were good, clear skies, calm seas, visibility stretching for miles. Yet somewhere between Guam and Clark Air Base in the Philippines, the Constellation ceased to exist. Its radio went silent, its presence vanished from the sky, and nothing was ever heard from it again. Witnesses did come forward, though what they saw only deepened the mystery. A tanker ship sailing near the planned route reported observing a bright flash in the sky, followed by 2 fiery explosions. To those on board it seemed unmistakable. An aircraft had exploded mid-air. They reported their sighting immediately, but searches of the area yielded nothing. No floating debris, no oil slick, no life rafts. If the Constellation had indeed exploded, it had left no trace behind. Investigators were baffled. Airliners that crash at sea almost always scatter fragments. Even in catastrophic mid-air explosions, wreckage is found. Here, nothing surfaced. Theories multiplied quickly. Some suggested catastrophic mechanical failure, though the Constellation was generally reliable. Others speculated about sabotage. The Vietnam conflict was escalating, and the men aboard Flight 739 were part of a build-up of American presence in Asia. The idea that the plane had been targeted by a bomb, by hostile action, even by covert operations, was not dismissed at the time, but again the absence of evidence made it impossible to prove. Without wreckage, without bodies, investigators had nothing but conjecture. The families of the 99 men and women aboard were left in agonizing uncertainty. Wives waited for telegrams that never came, parents for phone calls that never arrived. Children grew up with the story of a father lost not in battle, but in silence. For the soldiers' families, the pain was compounded by the fact that their loved ones were not listed as combat deaths. They had not fallen on a battlefield, they had vanished on a transport flight. For decades they were excluded from official memorials. Only in recent years have efforts been made to recognise their sacrifice alongside those who perished in uniform elsewhere. Flying Tigerline itself was deeply shaken. The airline had grown rapidly in the years after World War II, founded by former pilots who had flown supplies over the Himalayas for the American volunteer group, the famous Flying Tigers. The company's reputation was built on toughness and reliability, but Flight 739 became a shadow it could not shake. Although the airline continued operations for years afterward, this single loss defined its legacy in public memory. In Washington, questions were raised. Why had no wreckage been found despite intensive searches? Why were eyewitness reports of an explosion dismissed so quickly? Was the military concealing details about what had really happened? Some believed the answers lay in classified files, hidden away because the men aboard were bound for a conflict the government was not yet fully acknowledging. The official inquiry concluded only that the aircraft had disappeared without explanation, an answer that satisfied no one. The absence of physical evidence has ensured that the mystery of Flight 739 remains unresolved. Unlike other accidents where wreckage eventually surfaced, this case stands apart for its total erasure. Modern technology has not revisited the site with deep-sea scanning, leaving open the possibility that the remains of the Constellation still lie undisturbed on the Pacific seabed. Until such a discovery is made, speculation will continue. For aviation historians, Flight 739 is a reminder of the dangers of long overwater flights in an era before satellites, GPS, and global communication networks. A plane could vanish into the Pacific then, as easily as a ship could vanish into the Atlantic centuries earlier. But for families, historians, and investigators alike, what haunts is not just the danger, it is the silence. A plane full of soldiers, a crew of professionals, a clear night sky, and then nothing. Today, when people speak of aviation's great mysteries, Flight 739 is often overshadowed by the likes of Amelia Earhart or Malaysia Airlines MH370, yet in terms of sheer loss of life, it stands as one of the greatest unsolved tragedies in American aviation history. 99 people vanished in an instant, and generations later, the ocean still guards the secret of their fate. In 2019, a memorial was finally erected in Columbia Falls, Maine, to honour those who perished on Flight 739. Families gathered to read the names aloud, to place flowers, to acknowledge in stone what the sea had never returned. It was an act of remembrance long overdue, but even as the names were carved, the questions remained unanswered. The Pacific, vast and unyielding, had claimed another chapter in the long history of disappearances. Flight 739 reminds us that not every mystery lies in ancient skies or the early years of aviation. Even in the modern age of propeller-driven airliners, under clear skies with competent crews and well-mapped routes, entire flights can still be erased. And as long as the ocean refuses to give back its secrets, the names of those lost aboard the Star Tiger, the Star Ariel, and Flight 739 will remain bound together in history's gallery of vanishings, aircraft that lifted into the sky with confidence and were never seen again. Chapter 11, Pan Am Flight 7, 1957. On November 8, 1957, Pan American World Airways of Flight 7, known as the Clipper Romance of the Skies, departed San Francisco on what should have been a luxurious journey across the Pacific. Its destination was Honolulu, the first leg of a route that would eventually reach Tokyo and beyond. Aboard were 36 passengers and 8 crew members, among them businessmen, families, honeymooners and seasoned averters. Pan Am at that time represented the height of glamour in air travel. Its planes were flying hotels, symbols of post-war prosperity, where fine meals were served on china and passengers dressed in their best for the occasion. Yet beneath the polish of the airline's image lay a vulnerability that no one could predict. Before it reached Hawaii, the Clipper Romance of the Skies would vanish, leaving behind one of the most haunting mysteries in the history of American aviation. The aircraft was a Boeing 377 Stratocruiser, a massive double-decked airliner derived from the military B-29 bomber. It was known for its spacious cabins and lower lounge bar, but also for its complexity. 4 massive radial engines powered it, each one a masterpiece of engineering, but prone to problems if overstressed. On that clear November day, Flight 7 was expected to cruise smoothly across the Pacific, with its experienced captain, Gordon H. Brown, at the controls. He was a veteran pilot with thousands of hours of flying experience. The crew likewise was seasoned, and the weather forecast was favourable. For passengers, the journey promised comfort and safety. The first hours of the flight proceeded without incident. Flight 7 checked in with routine position reports as it crossed the vast expanse between California and Hawaii. But then, without warning, communication ceased. No distress call was received, no indication of trouble was heard. For hours, radio operators waited for a signal that never came. By the time the flight was overdue in Honolulu, panic had spread across control rooms. Pan Am, the Coast Guard, and the US Navy launched an intensive search. The following day, search planes spotted debris floating on the water roughly 900 miles northeast of Honolulu. It was the first sign of what had happened to Flight 7. Soon after, bodies were found bobbing among the wreckage. A total of 19 were eventually recovered, but dozens more were never seen again. The grim discovery confirmed the worst. The Clipper Romance of the Skies had gone down in the Pacific. Yet the recovery raised more questions than it answered. Autopsies of some victims revealed high levels of carbon monoxide in their blood, suggesting they had been exposed to smoke or fumes before the crash. This finding disturbed investigators. If an onboard fire had occurred, why had no distress call been sent? If engines had failed, why had the crew not radioed their situation? The lack of communication was as baffling as the crash itself. In an age when crews were trained to transmit even in the direst circumstances, silence implied either sudden catastrophe or equipment failure. But the evidence available was too limited to provide certainty. Theories abounded. Some believed that one of the Stratocruiser's engines had caught fire, filling the cabin with toxic smoke and rendering crew and passengers unconscious. Others speculated about mechanical failure, fuel leaks, or even sabotage. Pan Am, wary of public panic, leaned toward explanations that placed blame on unforeseen technical problems rather than malicious acts. Yet the questions lingered. Survivors' families demanded answers, but with most of the wreckage lost to the Pacific, little more could be determined. The tragedy struck at the heart of public confidence in aviation. Pan Am was the face of international air travel, and the loss of Flight 7 tarnished its aura of invincibility. Newspapers carried photographs of grieving families and debris-littered seas. For the first time, the glamorous image of globe-spanning luxury faltered before the reality that even the most advanced planes could be undone by a single failure. leaving no chance of survival. What made the case endure in memory was not only the loss, but the lingering aura of mystery. If smoke had overcome the passengers, why had the crew not donned oxygen masks? If an engine had failed, why had the Stratocruiser not limped along on the remaining 3 as it was designed to do? Why had no emergency transmission reached the radios that waited in silence? Each question was matched with another, and each theory seemed inadequate. The Pacific, vast and indifferent, had claimed the answers along with the plane. For the families, grief was made heavier by uncertainty. Some held funerals with empty caskets, while others clung to hope long after officials declared the passengers dead. Children grew up remembering a parent lost in the skies, without the closure of knowing exactly how or why. Pan Am, facing lawsuits and reputational damage, quietly compensated families but never shook the suspicion that something more sinister might have happened. In the absence of certainty, conspiracy theories took root, ranging from sabotage to secret military involvement, but none were ever substantiated. In later years, aviation historians revisited the case. Some pointed to maintenance issues with Stratocruisers, which had a history of engine fires. Others emphasized the peculiar carbon monoxide evidence, hinting that fumes might have incapacitated the crew before they could act. Yet others noted that the location of debris suggested the plane had descended in a controlled manner, perhaps attempting a ditching before impact. None of these explanations fully resolved the case, but all acknowledged its strangeness. Today, the disappearance and destruction of Pan Am Flight 7 stands as a reminder of aviation's mid-century growing pains. The post-war dream of global flight was real, but it came at a cost. Safety systems were still evolving, engines still temperamental, communication still imperfect. Behind the polished image of air travel as effortless and elegant lay the truth that the sky remained dangerous. The clipper romance of the skies never reached Honolulu, but its legacy endures. It is remembered not just for its tragic loss of life, but for the unanswered questions it left behind. Questions still studied by researchers, still haunting in their absence of closure. In its silence, it joins the gallery of ghost flights, a reminder that even in clear weather, under capable hands, with all systems apparently sound, an airliner can vanish into the ocean and leave behind only fragments, mysteries, and memories. Chapter 12, The DC-3 Disappearance, 1948. On the night of December 28, 1948, Douglas DC-3, carrying 32 passengers and crew, vanished without a trace while flying from San Juan, Puerto Rico to Miami, Florida. It was a routine flight over familiar waters, a short hop compared to transoceanic crossings, and the DC-3 was a proven workhorse of the skies. Thousands had flown safely in its sturdy fuselage during the war and in the booming post-war years. Yet for Flight and Sea 16002, the skies over the Caribbean became a final silent grave. To this day, not a scrap of wreckage has been confirmed, and the disappearance remains one of aviation's most haunting unsolved mysteries. The DC-3 was one of the most reliable aircraft of its age. Built during the 1930s, it had carried both soldiers and civilians across continents, earning a reputation as nearly indestructible. Crews trusted it. Passengers admired its smooth, steady ride. The very idea that such a plane could vanish was difficult to accept. On this December evening, the passengers included families returning from holiday, businessmen heading back to the mainland, and the crew led by Captain Robert Lindquist, a competent pilot with thousands of hours of experience. They had every reason to believe the flight would be routine. The journey began with a delay. The aircraft's batteries were low, causing electrical issues. Ground crew worked to fix the problem, and the captain reported he would fly without certain equipment operating at full strength. It was not unusual for crews of the era to make do with what they had, trusting the DC-3's resilience. At 10:03 p.m, flight NC 16002 lifted off into the Caribbean night, climbing toward its cruising altitude on a direct path to Miami. For much of the journey, radio contact with San Juan and Miami proceeded normally. The crew reported position and estimated arrival times. Nothing in their voices suggested distress. Around 4:13 a.m, the captain radioed that they were about 50 miles south of Miami and expected to land within minutes. It was the last transmission ever received. Controllers watched their radar, scanned their charts, and waited for the lights of the DC-3 to appear in the pre-dawn sky, but the plane never arrived. No distress call followed. No emergency landing was reported. The flight had simply dissolved into silence. Searches began immediately. Coast Guard ships and aircraft swept the approaches to Miami, then expanded outward across hundreds of square miles of ocean. The waters south of Florida are busy, dotted with ships, fishing boats, and coastal activity. If the DC-3 had gone down, someone should have seen or heard it, yet no one did. Not a body, not a seat cushion, not an oil slick was ever recovered. The sea remained indifferent, and the skies gave no clue. Families crowded Miami's airport, waiting in anguish for news that never came. Investigators faced a puzzle. The DC-3 had been close to its destination, its crew calm and confident, its course routine. Why had it failed to land? Some pointed to the earlier battery trouble, suggesting electrical issues may have knocked out radios and navigation instruments at a critical moment. If the plane drifted off course in darkness, it might have flown over the ocean until fuel ran out. Others speculated about sudden weather changes, turbulence, squalls, or downdrafts that struck without warning. But weather records that night showed calm conditions. Fuel mismanagement was another theory. Investigators discovered that one fuel selector valve had been turned off, raising the possibility that the plane had run out of usable fuel despite having reserves. Yet even if engines failed, the DC-3 was a glider compared to other aircraft of its day. A skilled pilot like Lindquist might have managed a ditching, leaving survivors or wreckage. The absence of both remained the greatest mystery. For the families, explanations mattered less than the aching silence. 32 people had boarded in Puerto Rico with plans, hopes, and destinations. They left behind empty seats at dinner tables, children without parents, and stories without endings. The loss of the DC-3 became a scar not only on Miami's aviation history, but on the collective memory of post-war air travel, when confidence in flying was growing rapidly. In later years, the disappearance was folded into the legend of the Bermuda Triangle. Writers noted the uncanny similarities to other vanishings: good weather, routine flights, sudden silence, and no wreckage. Some claimed the DC-3 had been pulled into a vortex or transported elsewhere entirely. Others imagined sabotage, smuggling, or even military intervention. None of these theories ever gained evidence, but they flourished in the absence of answers. The official Civil Aeronautics Board investigation concluded that the probable cause was a combination of low batteries, fuel issues, and navigational error, but the conclusion was hedged with uncertainty, acknowledging that no proof existed. The DC-3's disappearance was filed as cause unknown. That phrase, repeated in countless accident reports over the years, carries a particular weight. It means that even the best minds, with all available resources, could not pierce the silence left behind. What endures about the DC-3 disappearance is the ordinariness of it. This was not a record-breaking flight, not a daring pioneer crossing new frontiers. It was an everyday journey, the kind millions would take in the decades to come. The loss served as a reminder that mystery is not confined to the extraordinary. It can intrude into the routine, erasing lives without warning. Today, when passengers board modern jets bound for Miami from San Juan, few realize they are crossing the same stretch of sea where Flight C-16002 vanished. Beneath them, the waters still hold whatever remains of that December night. Perhaps the wreck lies buried under sand, its story locked in corroded metal. Perhaps it was scattered in currents too swift to preserve evidence. Whatever the case, the silence has endured for more than 70 years. The DC-3 disappearance of 1948 remains one of aviation's great unsolved mysteries. A tale of a proven aircraft, a veteran crew, and a short flight that should have been uneventful. Instead, it became a chapter in the haunted history of the skies, where absence speaks louder than wreckage, and silence is the only witness. On the night of June 23, 1950, Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 lifted into the skies from New York's LaGuardia Airport, bound for Minneapolis with a scheduled stop in Milwaukee. The aircraft was a Douglas DC-4, a dependable four-engine propeller plane used across the globe. Aboard were 55 passengers and 3 crew members, business travelers, families, servicemen, and ordinary citizens making a nighttime journey across the Midwest. It was a summer evening, Kouang, and the route was familiar. Yet over the dark waters of Lake Michigan, the flight disappeared. No distress call was ever received. No survivors were ever found. To this day, Flight 2501 remains one of America's most enduring aviation mysteries. At first, nothing suggested trouble. The DC-4 departed New York at 7:31 p.m, flying westward into a sky that soon grew heavy with storm clouds. As the plane neared the Great Lakes, weather worsened. Thunderheads towered, lightning flared across the horizon, and strong winds swept the region. Captain Robert Lind, an experienced pilot with thousands of hours of flight time, radioed controllers requesting permission to descend from 3,500 feet to 2,500 feet to avoid turbulence. Permission was denied, as other traffic was flying below. It was the last radio communication from Flight 2501. By midnight, the plane was overdue at Milwaukee. Controllers tried to reach it repeatedly, but silence answered. Search planes were dispatched at dawn. What they found was chilling. Roughly 18 miles off the coast of South Haven, Michigan, searchers discovered a vast oil slick on the lake's surface dotted with floating debris, seat cushions, fragments of upholstery, bits of clothing. More grim still, human remains were spotted drifting in the waves, though none intact enough to offer identification. The conclusion was inescapable. Flight 2501 had gone down in Lake Michigan, killing all of the 58 aboard. But the wreckage itself, the fuselage, the engines, the black box that might explain the disaster, was never found. The absence of the aircraft made an investigation nearly impossible. Divers attempted to locate the wreck, but Lake Michigan is treacherous. Its waters are deep, its bottom layered with mud that can bury debris quickly, and visibility is poor. Searchers dragged grappling hooks across the lakebed, but nothing conclusive was retrieved. Without wreckage, investigators could only speculate. Lightning strikes, engine failure, severe turbulence, or even pilot error were considered. The Civil Aeronautics Board listed the cause as unknown. Families were left not with answers, but with a void. For the relatives of those lost, the absence of wreckage was agonizing. Many clung to hope in the first days, imagining survivors adrift on rafts or clinging to debris. But as days turned to weeks, hope gave way to grief. Funerals were held without bodies. Families mourned with nothing tangible to lay to rest. Some visited the shores of Lake Michigan, staring out over the waves, imagining the final moments of their loved ones. The mystery of Flight 2501 became part of local folklore. Fishermen told of strange catches, bits of metal, fragments of fabric, hauled from their nets years later. Divers searching for shipwrecks occasionally reported glimpses of twisted aluminum far below. Each report sparked renewed interest, but none yielded conclusive evidence. The lake seemed determined to keep its secret. Unlike oceans, which sometimes release wreckage after decades, Lake Michigan buries and hides. Its shifting sands and deep mud entombed the DC-4, making it one of the largest commercial aircraft still missing in American waters. Over the decades, search efforts have been revived. In the early 2000s, author and explorer Clive Cussler's National Underwater and Marine Agency funded expeditions to scan the lakebed with sonar. His team located numerous wrecks, but none proved to be the missing DC-4. Each false lead deepened the mystery. Even today, small groups of researchers continue to scan the lake, hoping that modern technology might succeed where earlier efforts failed. Yet the search area is vast, the depths unforgiving, and the odds daunting. The disappearance of Flight 2501 is significant not just for its mystery, but for its scale. 58 lives were lost, making it the deadliest aviation disaster in American history at that time. And yet, without wreckage, the story has remained suspended between fact and speculation. Some theorists have suggested lightning may have struck the plane, igniting fuel and causing catastrophic failure. Others believe the storm winds tore the aircraft apart. Still others wonder if Captain Lind, denied his request to descend, flew directly into turbulence too violent for the DC-4 to withstand. Each theory has merit, but none can be proven. For the families, the lack of answers was compounded by the lack of recognition. Unlike soldiers lost in war, or victims of crashes where wreckage was recovered, the passengers of Flight 2501 were left out of national memory. Only local memorials in Michigan keep their names alive. In South Haven, a small stone marker lists the flight number and the date, a quiet acknowledgement of a tragedy that claimed dozens of lives yet left almost nothing behind. The mystery endures because of its ordinariness. Flight 2501 was not a pioneering journey across oceans or a high-profile celebrity flight. It was a commercial trip filled with ordinary people going about their lives. Their disappearance underscored a chilling truth. even the most routine journeys can end in silence. The lake that thousands cross daily in boats and planes remains the grave of 58 souls whose story ended without explanation. Today, aviation is far safer, with satellites tracking flights, black boxes built to withstand extremes, and emergency beacons that alert instantly. Yet the story of Flight 2501 lingers as a reminder of the era before such certainties. It is a reminder that nature's power, storms, waves, and deep waters can still erase, leaving only fragments of clothing and oil slicks to testify. And it is a reminder that mysteries are not confined to distant oceans or exotic locations. They can lie just off familiar shores, hidden beneath waters we think we know. The fate of Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 remains written in absence. The lake keeps its silence, the wreck unfound, the voices of its passengers lost to history. What endures is the haunting image of lights in the storm swallowed by darkness and an aircraft that never reached Milwaukee. In the endless waves of Lake Michigan, the echoes of Flight 2501 still linger, waiting for a discovery that may never come. Chapter 14, Braniff Flight 250, 1966. On the warm summer evening of August 6, 1966, Braniff International Airways Flight 250 departed Kansas City, Missouri, bound for Omaha, Nebraska. The aircraft, a British-built BAC-111 jet, carried 38 passengers and 4 crew members. It was a short hop across the Midwest, less than an hour in the air. Yet midway through the journey, the jet plunged from the night sky into a cornfield near Falls City, Nebraska. There were no survivors. Unlike many cases of vanished aircraft, wreckage from Flight 250 was found, but the violence of its destruction and the unanswered questions it left behind have ensured its place among the most unsettling tragedies of American aviation. The 111 was a sleek, modern jetliner designed for short to medium routes. Braniff, eager to showcase its new fleet, touted the plane as fast, safe and efficient. On this evening, Flight 250 lifted off at 11:08 p.m, with Captain Donald Pawley and First Officer James Hill at the controls. Both men were experienced, with years of flying Braniff routes. Weather across the region was stormy, with clusters of thunderstorms rolling through the plains. Radar showed towering clouds, heavy rain and lightning scattered along the flight path. Controllers cautioned crews to adjust their routes, but storms in the Midwest were common enough that most assumed Braniff 250 would find its way through safely. As the jet climbed north, passengers settled in for what should have been a routine nighttime flight. Some were business travelers heading to Omaha, others families returning home, and a few college students making the quick trip between cities. Stewardesses moved through the cabin offering drinks, adjusting blankets. Outside the windows, flashes of lightning danced on the horizon. The flight pressed forward into worsening weather. At 11:18 p.m, the crew checked in with controllers, reporting their position. It was the last routine communication. Minutes later, witnesses on the ground saw a terrifying sight. A bright flash in the storm clouds, followed by a fireball falling to earth. The Baku 111 had broken apart mid-air. Pieces of the aircraft rained across the Nebraska countryside, scattering over miles of farmland. Farmers rushed to the scene, only to find debris burning in fields and the grim realization that no one could have survived. By dawn, investigators and recovery crews converged on Falls City, confronted with a scene of devastation. The fuselage was torn apart, wings shattered, engines embedded in the earth. The violence of the breakup left little doubt. Flight 250 had come apart in the air before hitting the ground. The investigation was swift but complex. Weather radar confirmed the jet had flown directly into a massive thunderstorm cell. Winds in such cells can be brutal, with vertical currents powerful enough to tear an aircraft from the sky. The Civil Aeronautics Board concluded that Flight 250 encountered severe turbulence, possibly a downdraft that exceeded the structural limits of the aircraft. The BAC-111, while modern, had design limitations. Investigators believed it had suffered a structural failure in the storm causing the breakup. Yet questions lingered. Why had the crew flown into the storm when other routes were available? Why had no distress call been made? Had the aircraft itself been fatally vulnerable to weather it should have survived? The answers proved elusive. Some pilots speculated the Braniff crew had been attempting to climb above the storm, underestimating its strength. Others wondered if lightning had caused electrical failure, leaving the crew blind at a critical moment. Witnesses who saw the fireball suggested an explosion, though investigators found no evidence of sabotage. Ultimately, the storm itself became the most likely culprit, a natural force stronger than human judgment and stronger than the plane itself. For the families of those aboard, the explanations brought little comfort. 38 passengers and 4 crew members had boarded expecting to be in Omaha within the hour. Instead, their lives ended violently in the skies over Nebraska. Funerals were held across the Midwest, communities grieving the sudden loss. The wreckage was gathered, catalogued and analysed, but for loved ones, the image that endured was not technical reports but the memory of a routine flight that turned into a catastrophe in minutes. The accident left a mark on Braniff International Airways. Once seen as a rising star among American carriers, Braniff now faced scrutiny over its training, its decision-making and its choice of aircraft. The BAC-111 continued to fly, but questions about its structural resilience in severe turbulence never fully faded. For passengers, the name Braniff Flight 250 became a symbol of fragility in an age that had promised jet-age safety. The crash also underscored a broader truth about aviation. Technology could not conquer weather entirely. In the 1960s, jets flew higher and faster than ever before, but forecasting was still primitive by today's standards. Radar was limited, satellite imagery non-existent, and pilots often relied on intuition as much as instruments. Flight 250's loss became part of a series of mid-air breakups in storms that pushed regulators to demand better weather tracking and more rigorous avoidance protocols. What endures about Flight 250 is not only its tragedy but its haunting ordinariness. A short, familiar route, a modern jet, experienced crew, clear instructions from controllers, yet none of it was enough. In the end, a storm cloud over Nebraska became an invisible trap, pulling apart a plane full of people in seconds. Unlike the ocean vanishings that left no wreckage, Flight 250 left wreckage in abundance, but still no closure. The precise chain of events, the exact moment of failure, the reasons for the crew's decisions, all remain beyond certain knowledge. Today, near the crash site, a memorial stone lists the names of the 42 lost that night. It stands quietly among the fields, a reminder that even in the heartland, far from oceans or mountains, the sky can still claim lives without warning. Braniff Flight 250 did not vanish into silence. It fell in flames. Yet its story belongs among the chronicles of disappearance all the same, for what disappeared that night was certainty, the belief that modern jets could not be torn apart by storms. It remains a story of fragility, of weather's wrath, and of how quickly the ordinary can turn into the unexplainable. Chapter 15, The Alaskan Triangle, 1972. On the morning of October 16, 1972, a small twin-engine Cessna 310 lifted from Anchorage, Alaska, carrying 4 men: US House Majority Leader Hale Boggs, Alaska Congressman Nick Begich, aide Russell Brown, and pilot Don Johns. Their destination was Juneau, a flight of just over 3 hours across some of the most rugged and isolated terrain in North America. It was a crisp autumn day, with snow already frosting the mountains and the endless forest stretching beneath them. To the men aboard, it was a routine political trip. Boggs was campaigning with Begich, speaking to voters in Alaska's remote communities, but within minutes of takeoff the plane vanished. No distress call was ever received, no wreckage ever recovered. Despite one of the largest search and rescue operations in American history, the Cessna 310 disappeared into the Alaskan wilderness and was never seen again. The loss of 2 members of Congress in a single flight was unprecedented. Hale Boggs, a Democrat from Louisiana, was one of the most powerful men in Washington, a close ally of Presidents Kennedy and Johnson. Nick Begich was a popular Alaskan lawmaker, widely expected to win re-election. Their disappearance sent shockwaves through the nation's capital and dominated headlines for weeks. President Nixon ordered a massive search. Over 40 military aircraft, 50 civilian planes, and thousands of personnel scoured an area larger than some US states. The Coast Guard combed coastal waters, while Army helicopters hovered over mountain ridges and valleys, yet the search turned up nothing. After 39 days, with no trace of wreckage or bodies, officials called it off. The plane and its passengers were declared lost. The mystery of Flight Begich Boggs, as it became known, cemented Alaska's reputation as a graveyard for aircraft. The state's wilderness is unforgiving. Jagged peaks, sudden storms, vast stretches of forest and tundra, where a downed plane can vanish without a trace. Locals were not surprised that the Cessna had disappeared, but the scale of the search and the prominence of those aboard gave the incident an outsized profile. For families, the lack of answers was devastating. Widows and children were left with no remains to bury, no final evidence of what had happened. The mystery became part of the state's lore, woven into the broader legend of the so-called Alaskan Triangle. The Alaskan Triangle is a region stretching from Anchorage to Juneau to Barrow, encompassing some of the most treacherous landscapes on Earth. Since the 1950s, thousands of people, pilots, hikers, hunters, have vanished there without a trace. Entire planes have disappeared, sometimes with dozens aboard. While many losses can be explained by bad weather, navigational errors or mechanical failures, the sheer number of vanishings has given the area a reputation similar to that of the Bermuda Triangle. Locals speak of the land itself as hungry, swallowing men and machines into its depths. Some blame glaciers, which can bury wreckage under shifting ice, grinding it into nothing. Others whisper of magnetic anomalies, or even supernatural forces. Whatever the cause, the Alaskan wilderness has claimed more than its share of mysteries. The disappearance of Boggs and Begich remains the most famous of these cases. Because of Boggs' political stature, rumours quickly spread that foul play might have been involved. Some speculated the plane had been sabotaged, its wreckage hidden to cover up a crime. Boggs had publicly criticised the FBI just months earlier, accusing it of abuse of power, and conspiracy theorists wondered if his disappearance was no accident. Others believed organised crime, with which Boggs had also clashed, might have played a role, yet no evidence ever emerged to support such theories. The simplest explanation, that the plane encountered bad weather or mechanical trouble and went down in the wilderness, remains the most likely. But without wreckage, speculation has never fully died. The Begich and Boggs families lived with uncertainty for decades. In Alaska, the Begich name endured. Nick's son, Mark Begich, would later become a US senator. For the Boggs family, the loss was equally searing. Hale's widow, Lindy Boggs, went on to serve 9 terms in Congress, often invoking her husband's memory. Their daughter, journalist Cokie Roberts, spoke often of the unresolved nature of his disappearance. For both families, the absence of wreckage meant the wound never fully closed. The disappearance also had political consequences. Boggs' seat in Congress was filled by his widow, and Nick Begich's re-election proceeded posthumously. His name remained on the ballot, and voters returned him to office even though he was already presumed dead. The extraordinary outcome highlighted the confusion and grief that followed the tragedy. What makes the case linger in memory is the absolute silence that followed the Cessna's takeoff. The men aboard were prominent, the plane relatively modern, the weather acceptable. Searchers expected wreckage to be found quickly. Instead, they found nothing. The Alaskan wilderness had claimed another secret, but this time the victims were among the most visible figures in the nation. That juxtaposition, powerful men disappearing as completely as anonymous hunters or bush pilots, gave the mystery its resonance. Today, the Alaskan Triangle continues to claim lives. Pilots still fly its routes, hikers still trek its trails, and each year more vanish. Some are eventually found. Wreckage uncovered by melting glaciers remains stumbled upon by hunters, but many are not. The wilderness is vast, and human traces are easily erased. The disappearance of Hale Boggs and Nick Begich remains the Triangle's most enduring story, a reminder that status and power mean little in the face of nature's immensity. The Cessna 310 that carried them has never been located. Perhaps it lies buried beneath ice, entombed in a glacier that moves silently toward the sea. Perhaps it sank into a lake too deep for divers to reach. Perhaps, as some locals insist, the wilderness simply swallows what it chooses. Whatever the truth, the disappearance of Flight Begich Boggs is both a political tragedy and a symbol of the Alaskan Triangle's dark reputation. It is a story of silence, of unanswered questions, and of how the sky can erase even those most watched by history. The disappearance of Hale Boggs and Nick Begich in 1972 drew the world's attention to Alaska. But for the people who live there, it was simply the most famous chapter in a much longer story. Alaska's skies have been swallowing planes for as long as aircraft have dared to cross its wilderness. The state has more pilots per capita than any other in America, more airstrips than highways, and more small craft in the air on any given day than some nations see in a week. For remote towns, mail, food and medicine arrive not by truck but by bushplane. To live in Alaska is to live with flight as a necessity, and with that necessity comes risk. Thousands have vanished into the endless sky, their planes and bodies never recovered. For every well-known case like Boggs and Begich, there are dozens more. stories carried not in national headlines but in the memories of families and in the whispered warnings of local pilots. The sheer scale of the land contributes to the mystery. Alaska is twice the size of Texas, yet much of it remains wilderness. Mountains jagged with glaciers, tundra stretching for miles, forests dense as walls. Weather changes in an instant. A sunny morning can become a whiteout blizzard by afternoon. Winds funnel through mountain passes like invisible rivers, flipping small plains in seconds. The magnetic North Pole lurks uncomfortably close, playing tricks on compasses. Even in modern times, with GPS and satellite communication, pilots know Alaska can still strip them of the certainty. In the mid-20th century, before such tools, the risk was multiplied. Planes went down and simply never came back. Consider the disappearance of a C-124 Globemaster in 1950. The massive military transport plane vanished in the Yukon en route to Elmendorf Air Force Base, carrying more than 40 servicemen. Despite weeks of searching, no trace was found. Hunters and bush pilots would later claim to see fragments of wreckage deep in mountain valleys, but nothing was ever confirmed. Or the many small charter flights, families, hunters, fishermen, who never arrived at their destinations. In Alaska, such stories are not rare. They are part of the fabric of daily life, reminders that the sky is both lifeline and predator. The cultural response to these vanishings is shaped by endurance. Alaskans learn to live with absence. A father who went out hunting by plane and never came home. A teacher flying back from Anchorage whose seat in the classroom remained empty. Memorials are few, wreckage often unrecovered, and graves sometimes symbolic. The wilderness makes closure impossible. Instead, people build resilience. They tell stories of those lost, keeping their memory alive against the silence of the land. The phrase Alaska's endless sky is not just poetic, it reflects the reality that here, the sky seems larger than anywhere else. It stretches beyond horizons, unbroken by cities or highways, endless in its depth and danger. Pilots describe the sensation of flying over Alaska as exhilarating and humbling in equal measure. Beneath them lie valleys that no human foot has ever touched, rivers that cut through forests older than history, and somewhere in that immensity lie plains, dozens, perhaps hundreds, resting silently hidden by ice, water, and time. The mystery persists because the wilderness erases evidence so thoroughly. Glaciers swallow wreckage, grinding it beneath ice that moves inexorably toward the sea. Lakes as deep as fjords conceal fuselages on their muddy bottoms. Forests grow over crash sites, reclaiming metal in moss and soil. In some cases, decades later, hunters stumble upon twisted aluminum or a cracked engine block, relics of a plane that vanished in another generation. But for most, no such discovery is ever made. Families live with questions, and the land keeps its silence. The legend of the Alaskan Triangle grew from this history. Stretching between Anchorage, Juneau, and Barrow, the region has become shorthand for vanishings. Some say magnetic anomalies cause compass needles to spin, leading pilots astray. Others suggest geological activity, hidden vortexes, or stranger forces still. Skeptics point to the weather, the geography, and the sheer number of planes in the air as explanations. Whatever the truth, the reputation is real. Alaska is a place where aircraft vanish at rates unlike anywhere else in the United States. For lawmakers in Washington, the disappearance of Boggs and Begich was a shock, but for Alaskans, it was simply another chapter in a long, grim narrative. Local pilots still tell newcomers the same lesson: respect the land as respect the sky. Do not underestimate storms. Do not assume technology will save you, and always be ready for the possibility that the wilderness may take you. It is advice born from generations of loss, passed down like folklore but grounded in reality. In the decades since, technology has reduced the frequency of vanishings but not eliminated them. Satellites track planes, GPS provides exact coordinates, and emergency beacons alert rescuers instantly. Yet even in the 21st century, aircraft have vanished in Alaska, their signals suddenly cut, their wreckage never found. The land is simply too vast, too wild, too unforgiving. The endless sky remains unconquered. Alaska's story is not just one of loss, but of resilience. The families of the missing endure, communities adapt, pilots continue to fly knowing the risks but accepting them as part of life in the north. And beneath it all lies the haunting knowledge that somewhere out there, in valleys and glaciers and lakes, rest the bones of countless planes and the souls of those who flew them. Their stories are written not in final reports or wreckage recovered, but in the silence of absence, the immensity of the sky, and the enduring mystery of a land where flight is both lifeline and gamble. In Alaska, disappearances are not anomalies, they are part of the landscape. The sky stretches forever, and in its depths, answers can vanish as easily as planes. That truth has shaped the people who live beneath it, teaching them to endure uncertainty, to honour memory, and to accept that sometimes in the endless sky, things are taken and never returned. On January 26, 1950, a Douglas DC-4 operated by the United States Air Force lifted from Anchorage, Alaska, bound for Great Falls, Montana. On board were 44 people, military personnel, civilians and crew, most of them heading south after duty in Alaska. The DC-4 was a dependable four-engine transport aircraft, widely used in the years after World War II for both military and civilian operations. It had carried countless passengers safely across continents and oceans. Yet on that cold January morning, as the plane crossed into Canada, it vanished over the Yukon wilderness. Neither wreckage nor bodies were ever recovered, despite one of the largest search efforts of its time. The flight seemed straightforward. The DC-4 departed Anchorage under clear skies, its engines steady, its cargo routine. Radio contact was established as it crossed into Canadian airspace. Controllers logged its position near Snag, Yukon, an area of rolling mountains, deep forests and frozen rivers. After that, silence. The aircraft never reported again. When it failed to arrive in Montana, alarm spread quickly. The United States and Canada launched a massive joint search, deploying hundreds of aircraft and thousands of personnel to scour the Yukon. But the wilderness was merciless. Days of flying yielded nothing but snow, ice and silence. The scale of the search reflected both the number of people aboard and the strategic importance of the route. The DC-4 was flying a corridor used extensively during the war to ferry supplies between the US and Alaska. Radar coverage was limited, and navigation depended largely on radio beacons and visual landmarks. In January, however, the Yukon lay locked in winter. Endless expanses of white, temperatures plunging well below zero, and frequent storms sweeping down from the Arctic. A plane that went down in such conditions could be hidden instantly, its wreckage buried beneath snow and ice before searchers even knew where to look. As days turned into weeks, search planes covered more than 350,000 square miles, an area larger than many countries. They flew grid patterns, scanned valleys, and followed river system, hoping to spot debris or smoke from survivors. Nothing emerged. The forests and mountains remained still. With each passing day, hope dwindled. Families of the 44 waited for news that never came, clinging first to the possibility of a forced landing, then to the hope of wreckage, and finally to the painful acceptance of loss without explanation. Investigators faced a puzzle. The DC-4 was reliable, its engines robust, and the crew experienced. Weather had been cold but flyable. Why had the plane disappeared so suddenly, with no distress call? Some suggested catastrophic structural failure, though the aircraft type had no widespread history of such. Others pointed to icing. In Yukon winters, ice can accumulate rapidly on wings and engines, robbing a plane of lift and power. If the DC-4 encountered severe icing, it might have stalled and plummeted before the crew could radio for help. But without wreckage, these theories remained speculation. The disappearance soon became part of the region's lore. Hunters and trappers spoke of hearing distant engines on the day of the flight, followed by silence. In later years, rumours circulated of twisted metal glimpsed in remote valleys, only for follow-up searches to find nothing. The Yukon is littered with wrecks from decades of aviation, many discovered only by accident years later. Yet the DC-4, larger than most, carrying dozens of people, has never been confirmed. It remains one of the largest aircraft still missing on the North American continent. For the families, the absence of closure was crushing. Mothers and fathers waited for letters that never came. Wives raised children with stories of fathers who had boarded a plane in Alaska and never returned. Communities held memorial services without bodies to bury, placing names on plaques instead of gravestones. In Great Falls, where the plane was expected to land, the event became a haunting memory, retold in anniversaries but never resolved. The loss also had implications for aviation safety. It highlighted the dangers of northern routes where navigation aids were sparse and search operations daunting. In the years that followed, both the US and Canada invested in their infrastructure, more radio beacons, weather stations, and emergency planning for Arctic flights. But even with improvements, the wilderness remained capable of swallowing planes without trace. Decades later, modern searchers have returned to the mystery. Teams with sonar, ground-penetrating radar, and even satellite imagery have attempted to locate the wreck, focusing on lakes and valleys near its last known position. Some believe the DC-4 lies submerged in a remote lake, preserved beneath cold, dark waters. Others argue it may rest in a mountain valley, hidden by forest and snowdrifts, its aluminum slowly blending into the landscape. Despite these efforts, the Yukon continues to guard its secret. The story of the DC-4 over the Yukon is not only about a vanished aircraft, it is about the silence of wilderness. Unlike the ocean, which sometimes releases wreckage to shore, the frozen north holds tightly. Planes that vanish there are often never seen again. For every recovered wreck, there are others still missing, their stories known only to the trees, the ice, and the mountains. In aviation history, the disappearance remains overshadowed by more famous cases like Amelia Earhart or Flight 19. Yet its scale makes it just as haunting. 44 people, an entire community of lives, were erased in a single moment. Their absence still echoes through the Yukon, whispered in stories of hunters and remembered in family lines cut short. The DC-4's fate is likely mundane in its cause, weather, icing, mechanical failure, but extraordinary in its erasure. It reminds us that not all mysteries involve conspiracy or supernatural forces. Sometimes the land itself is mystery enough. The Yukon, vast and unyielding, is capable of swallowing a plane whole and keeping it hidden for generations. Until the wreck is found, the DC-4 and its passengers remain part of that silence, part of the endless ledger of the skies where flights depart, destinations wait, and sometimes nothing ever arrives. In the early hours of December 24, 1964, a Flying Tiger Line cargo plane prepared for what should have been a routine trans-Pacific mission. Designated Flight 282, the Lockheed L-1049H Super Constellation was scheduled to carry military supplies from San Francisco to Kadena Air Base in Okinawa, with a refueling stop in Alaska. Flying Tiger Line, founded by former World War II pilots, had built its reputation on hauling heavy freight for both commercial and military clients. Its constellations were trusted workhorses, graceful aircraft with triple tails and long-range endurance. Yet that Christmas Eve, within minutes of lifting off from San Francisco International Airport, Flight 282 would be gone, its wreckage scattered across a fog-bound hillside, its three-man crew lost, and its cause steeped in troubling questions. The weather that night was dreadful. San Francisco lay blanketed in thick fog, with rain sweeping across the bay and winds howling against the coastal hills. Controllers described conditions as treacherous but not impossible. Pilots in that era often flew in worse. At 11:14 p.m, Captain John Bruce, First Officer Paul Pennington, and Flight Engineer Charles Lockhart pushed the throttles forward, and the four-engine Super Constellation roared down the runway. Heavy with cargo, it lifted into the night sky, climbing through sheets of fog and rain. For the first few minutes, the flight seemed normal. The crew contacted controllers, reporting their departure and initial heading. Their voices carried no trace of panic or confusion, but just minutes later, silence fell. The Constellation had vanished from radar screens. Controllers tried repeatedly to raise the crew, but there was no response. Search crews were dispatched quickly, hampered by the same rain and fog that had confronted the pilots. At 4 a.m, reports came in from Sonoma County, north of San Francisco. Residents had heard a roaring crash in the hills. By dawn, searchers confirmed the worst. Flight 282 had slammed into a fog-covered ridge near the town of Cotati, just 25 miles from its point of departure. The wreckage told a violent story. The Constellation had ploughed into the hillside at high speed, scattering twisted metal and debris for hundreds of yards. Fire consumed much of the cargo and there were no survivors. The three crewmen had died instantly, leaving investigators to piece together what had gone wrong in those final moments. Why had an experienced crew flying a proven aircraft failed to clear the hills so close to the airport? Investigators quickly determined that the flight had deviated from its intended course. Instead of turning westward over the ocean, Flight 282 had veered north, climbing over the rugged hills of Marin and Sonoma counties. At its altitude, it should have cleared them easily, but evidence suggested the plane had been flying lower than required. Weather reports confirmed strong winds aloft, downdrafts and turbulence that could have pushed the heavy constellation off its course and lower into danger. But weather alone did not explain everything. The crash occurred just after takeoff, when the crew should have been following precise departure instructions. Why they failed to do so remains uncertain. Some theorize that instrument failure in the fog confused the pilots. Others believe they may have become disoriented, mistaking headings in the turbulent weather. Another possibility was weight. The constellation was carrying a heavy load of military cargo, and though within limits on paper, the stress of climbing through stormy skies could have reduced its performance. In such conditions, even a minor misjudgment could prove fatal. For the families of the 3 men aboard, the answers offered little solace. Captain Bruce, Pennington and Lockhart were seasoned professionals, men who had flown countless missions for Flying Tiger Line. That they could be undone within minutes of takeoff so close to home was a bitter truth. The crash site became a grim reminder of how unforgiving aviation can be, even at the very start of a long journey. The timing of the crash, Christmas Eve, added to its sorrow. Across America, families prepared for holiday gatherings, while in Sonoma County, locals awoke to flames in the hills, the sky lit by burning wreckage. Newspapers carried the story on December the 25th alongside reports of festive celebrations, a jarring contrast between joy and tragedy. For Flying Tiger Line, the crash of Flight 282 raised difficult questions. The airline had already endured the loss of Flight 739 in 1962, which vanished over the Pacific with 99 souls aboard. Now another constellation, though found within hours, underscored the risks of long-haul cargo flights through difficult weather. Public scrutiny fell on the airline's procedures, training and maintenance. Flying Tiger Line defended its crews, pointing to the treacherous conditions of the night and the inherent hazards of global cargo routes. Still, the loss contributed to the airline's reputation as daring but sometimes unlucky, a carrier whose planes seem too often entangled in mystery and tragedy. In aviation history, Flight 282 is sometimes overshadowed by more dramatic vanishings that left no trace at all. Yet its story is no less haunting. Here was a plane that should have been well on its way across the Pacific, reduced to wreckage in hills visible from its departure city. The speed with which it was lost, minutes after takeoff, served as a reminder that danger lurks at every stage of flight. It was not the vast ocean or enemy skies that claimed it, but the combination of weather, terrain and human vulnerability just beyond the runway lights. Today the crash site is little known, overgrown with brush, its twisted debris long removed. Yet for those who remember, the loss of Flight 282 stands as a stark chapter in the story of aviation disappearances. Though its wreckage was found, its deeper causes remain debated. Was it weather, disorientation, or a flaw in planning? No single answer has ever silenced the questions. Flight 282 reminds us that disappearance does not always mean vanishing without a trace. Sometimes the wreckage is there, smoking in the hills, but the mystery remains intact. 3 men set out across the Pacific that night, entrusted with a mission of routine cargo, and within minutes they were gone. The hills north of San Francisco claimed them, and the silence of unanswered questions has lingered ever since. On October the 13th, 1972, a twin-engine Fairchild FH227D, carrying 45 people, mostly young members of a Uruguayan rugby team, along with the friends and family, departed Montevideo, Uruguay, bound for Santiago, Chile. The route required crossing the mighty Andes Mountains, one of the most treacherous ranges in the world. The flight was routine in plan, but nothing about what followed would be ordinary. Within hours, the aircraft disappeared into the high peaks. Its fate became one of the most infamous survival stories in aviation history, but its disappearance and the grim revelations that followed remain a haunting case of how quickly a flight can transform from safe passage to unthinkable ordeal. The journey began with optimism. The rugby team was travelling to Chile for a friendly match, their spirits high as they laughed, played cards, and gazed at the mountains outside their windows. Weather reports were poor. Cloud cover thickened around the Andes, snow squalls swept across ridges, and turbulence rattled the aircraft. Still, the crew pressed on. At 3:30 p.m, the pilots radioed they were preparing to descend towards Santiago. Minutes later, contact was lost. For searchers on the ground, the Andes offered little mercy. The range stretched for thousands of miles, its peaks jagged, its valleys remote. Storms quickly erased visibility, burying possible wreckage beneath snow. For days, the plane's fate was unknown. Families clung to hope while rescuers combed mountain passes in vain. The aircraft had in fact crashed high on a glacier at over 11,000 feet. It struck a ridge, tore apart and slid down into a remote valley. 12 people died instantly. Others were injured, but 33 survived the initial impact. Their ordeal was only beginning. They had little food, just a few chocolate bars, wine, and scraps from luggage. Rescue seemed likely at first. They expected helicopters within hours, perhaps days, but the mountains kept their secret. Search planes flew overhead, but the fuselage, painted white, blended with the snow. Radios crackled with grim news. After 10 days, the official search was called off. The survivors, huddled in the gutted fuselage, listened in despair. They were on their own. As days turned into weeks, hunger became their greatest enemy. The thin air and freezing nights drained their strength. Snowstorms buried their meagre shelter, and avalanches threatened to sweep them away. With no food left, they faced a decision that would horrify the world but save their lives. They began to eat the flesh of those who had died in the crash. It was not a decision made lightly. Survivors spoke of long discussions, prayers, and tears before accepting that the only way to endure was to use the dead as sustenance. It became their unthinkable salvation, a grim pact between the living and the departed. Months passed in this frozen prison. Attempts to hike out failed. The peaks loomed too high, the snow too deep. Then in December, with their bodies weak but their determination unbroken, two of the strongest survivors, Fernando Parrado and Roberto Canessa, set out across the mountains. Carrying makeshift sleeping bags, a bit of food and boundless resolve, they trekked for 10 days through blizzards and across glaciers. On the verge of collapse, they finally encountered a Chilean herdsman near a river. With his help, they reached authorities. News broke across the world. After 72 days, survivors of the crash had been found alive in the Andes. Rescuers rushed helicopters to the site, lifting out 14 emaciated but living souls. Their survival was hailed as miraculous, but the revelation of cannibalism sparked controversy. Some criticized them, while others defended their choice as the only possible way to endure. The survivors themselves spoke with honesty. They described their decision as born not of savagery but of reverence. The dead had given the living a chance to see another sunrise. In time, the world came to understand their story not as scandal, but as testament to human will. For investigators, the crash underscored how misjudgments in navigation could prove fatal in mountains. The crew had believed they had cleared the Andes and begun descent when in fact they were still among the highest peaks. Clouds, turbulence, and reliance on dead reckoning led them into disaster. The lesson for aviation was stark. Even in an age of modern aircraft, terrain demanded absolute caution, and overconfidence could lead to catastrophe. The Andes flight remains one of the most extraordinary survival stories in aviation history. It is also a tale of disappearance, for 72 days the world believed all aboard were dead, their plane swallowed by mountains. Families mourned, funerals were held, obituaries written. Then, almost 3 months later, the living emerged, carrying with them a story so harrowing and inspiring that it still echoes decades later. Today, the site of the crash is a place of pilgrimage. The remains of the fuselage still lie on the glacier, slowly succumbing to time. Survivors and families return to honour those who were lost, laying flowers on the snow where the ordeal began. The story has been retold in books and films, most recently in cinematic detail, but no retelling can fully capture the silence of those nights, the despair of waiting for rescue, or the courage it took to walk out of the mountains. The Andes flight reminds us that disappearance does not always mean permanent erasure. Sometimes the vanished return, bearing stories of unimaginable endurance. Yet the haunting element remains. A plane full of young men vanished into the clouds, its fate hidden for weeks, its truth darker and more extraordinary than anyone imagined. It is a story of absence, survival, and the razor edge between life and death, high in the frozen sky. In the West, stories of vanished aircraft often filled headlines, shaping legends like the Bermuda Triangle. But behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union carried its own catalogue of disappearances, many obscured by secrecy, censorship, and political control. In the vast reaches of Siberia, over the endless steppes of Central Asia, and across the frozen Arctic, Soviet planes sometimes vanished as completely as those over the Atlantic. Unlike in the West, however, the public rarely heard the details. Families were given vague explanations, if any at all. The state controlled the narrative, often classifying crashes and disappearances as state secrets. As a result, many cases remain half-remembered, whispered through survivor accounts, old records, or fragments of declassified files. The Soviet Union relied heavily on aviation to connect its sprawling territory. With rail and road systems insufficient for its sheer size, planes were lifelines to remote towns, military outposts, and resource camps. Thousands of aircraft filled the skies, many of them rugged machines like the Ilyushin Il-14, Antonov transports, and the Tupolev series of airliners. These aircraft faced some of the harshest flying conditions on Earth. Blizzards, crosswinds sweeping down from the Urals, endless taiga forests with no safe place to land. In such a landscape, a plane that went down could remain hidden for decades. And when disappearances occurred, the government was often more concerned with maintaining an image of control than with telling the truth. One of the most striking examples came in 1951, when a Lisunov Li-2, essentially the Soviet version of the American DC-3, vanished en route from Yakutsk to Irkutsk, deep in Siberia. On board were more than 20 passengers, including scientists bound for Moscow. The flight never arrived. Searchers scoured hundreds of miles of tundra and forest, but nothing was found. Rumours spread among locals of wreckage glimpsed in remote valleys, but official word remained minimal. Families were told only that their loved ones were lost in flight, with no further details. It was not until decades later that scattered documents suggested the plane had strayed far off course in a snowstorm, perhaps crashing into the mountains near Lake Baikal. The wreck has never been confirmed. Another mysterious loss occurred in 1965, when an Antonov An-2 biplane carrying villagers in Kazakhstan vanished while flying between collective farms. The An-2 was one of the most ubiquitous aircraft in Soviet service, slow but dependable, able to land almost anywhere. Yet this flight disappeared without trace. Locals claimed to have seen lights over the steppe, then nothing. No wreckage was ever found. Some speculated that the plane had gone down in one of the vast salt lakes and been swallowed. Others whispered of military involvement. Official reports said only that the flight was missing. Families received no closure, and the story faded into silence. Disappearance also struck the military. During the Cold War, Soviet bombers and reconnaissance aircraft routinely patrolled Arctic skies, pushing machines and crews to their limits. In 1970, a Tupolev Tu-16 bomber vanished while flying over the Barents Sea on a training mission. Radar contact was lost suddenly, and search operations, hampered by icy seas and secrecy, found nothing. Western intelligence later intercepted chatter, suggesting the plane had suffered catastrophic failure. But without debris, speculation persisted. The Soviet press never reported the loss, and the families were told little beyond that their loved ones had died in service to the motherland. Secrecy compounded these tragedies. In the Soviet system, accidents were often seen as embarrassing signs of weakness. Admitting to lost planes, particularly civilian airliners, could undermine confidence in the state. Thus, many disappearances were simply not reported. Newspapers might run a short announcement weeks later, couched in vague language, or avoid coverage entirely. Survivors who spoke too openly about accidents risked censure. In some cases, files were locked away in military archives sealed for decades. Yet the Soviet people were not blind to the dangers of flight. Stories circulated quietly, of planes that left Moscow and never arrived in Leningrad, of pilots who vanished while ferrying supplies to Siberian camps, of mysterious lights seen before a disappearance. In remote villages, hunters sometimes stumbled across wreckage years later, twisted metal half buried in snowdrifts, still bearing faded red stars. Often, these discoveries were not even reported, either out of fear of official scrutiny or because locals assumed authorities already knew. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 brought new light to some of these cases. Declassified files revealed dozens of aircraft listed as missing in the vast northern territories. Some wrecks were eventually located by expeditions or satellite imagery, confirming what had long been suspected, that weather, mechanical failure and human error had claimed many lives. Yet others remain mysteries. Planes carrying dozens of passengers are still listed as lost, their resting places unknown in the immensity of Siberia and the Arctic. These Soviet disappearances highlight the same themes seen in the West: machines that vanish, families left without closure, landscapes that conceal evidence, but they are marked by an added layer of silence imposed by the state. Where American or British newspapers speculated and sensationalized, Soviet citizens were left with whispers and rumours. The mysteries became part of folklore, tales of cursed routes, ghost planes glimpsed in the clouds, pilots who flew into storms and never returned. Today, researchers and explorers continue to investigate these cases. Expeditions to Siberia occasionally uncover fragments of aluminum and faded insignia, clues to crashes long forgotten by officialdom. Families still petition for records, hoping to learn the truth about loved ones lost half a century ago. And historians, piecing together scraps of testimony and newly opened files, are beginning to map the hidden history of Soviet aviation's vanishings. The Soviet disappearances remind us that mystery is not only born of oceans or jungles, it can also be shaped by secrecy. When wreckage is hidden by wilderness and the truth is hidden by politics, the result is a silence even deeper than the physical absence of a plane. These stories linger, half-told, shadows behind the Iron Curtain, where the sky itself became another frontier of uncertainty. On the night of December the 29th, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 prepared to land in Miami after a routine trip from New York. The aircraft was a wide-bodied Lockheed L-1011 TriStar, one of the most advanced airliners of its time. It carried 163 passengers and 13 crew, and the mood aboard was calm as the plane descended into Florida's flat, dark expanse. But within minutes, the routine turned to disaster. Instead of landing safely on the glittering runways of Miami International, the jet plunged into the black waters of the Everglades. 96 people were killed, 75 survived, and the wreckage of Flight 401 would go on to fuel one of aviation's most chilling legends, tales of ghosts haunting Eastern's fleet. The trouble began with something small, a malfunctioning landing gear light. As the plane approached Miami, the crew noticed that the green light indicating the nose gear was locked in place had failed to illuminate. Unsure whether the gear itself had malfunctioned or if it was simply a burned-out bulb, Captain Robert Loft, First Officer Albert Stockstill, and Flight Engineer Don Repo began troubleshooting. They removed the light assembly, checks and fuses, and debated whether the problem was electrical or mechanical. In the process, their attention drifted from the most important task, flying the aircraft. To buy time, the crew placed the L-1011 into a holding pattern over the Everglades. It was a dark night, with no city lights beneath them, only the endless swamp stretching in silence. Altitude hold autopilot was engaged, keeping the plane steady, or so they thought. As the men focused on the landing gear light, a small but crucial bump on the control column went unnoticed. The autopilot, subtly disengaged, allowed the aircraft to enter a gradual descent. No alarm sounded. No one in the cockpit realized they were sinking. At 11:42 p.m, air traffic control contacted the crew, asking about their progress. Loft replied casually, still preoccupied with the light. Seconds later, the altimeter showed the air pressure was at 2,000 feet and dropping fast. But in the dimly lit cockpit, focused on the landing gear, the crew missed the signs. Passengers too were unaware, chatting softly in the cabin, preparing for arrival. Then in an instant, the black water of the Everglades rose up to meet them. The TriStar struck the swamp at over 200 miles per hour, tearing apart in an explosion of metal, water and fire. The crash was catastrophic, but the swamp's marshy surface absorbed some of the impact. Against all odds, 75 people survived. Rescue helicopters from Miami raced to the scene, their searchlights sweeping across wreckage half submerged in mud. Survivors clung to floating debris, their cries piercing the humid night. For hours, rescuers waded chest deep through muck, pulling the living to safety. Many were badly injured, but alive. The cockpit crew, however, perished save for Captain Loft, who succumbed later in a hospital. Investigators soon identified the cause: human error compounded by distraction. The crew had become fixated on the landing gear light, failing to notice their slow descent. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded that the crash resulted from failure of the flight crew to monitor flight instruments during the final 4 minutes of flight. It was a tragedy of modern aviation, an advanced plane undone not by mechanical failure but by diverted human attention. Yet Flight 401's story did not end with the investigation. In the months that followed, rumours spread among Eastern Airlines crews. flight attendants and pilots began reporting strange occurrences aboard other L1011s in the fleet, particularly those that had been repaired with salvaged parts from Flight 401. Some swore they saw the ghostly figures of Captain Loft or Flight Engineer Repo seated in cockpits or strolling through cabins. Passengers reported comforting encounters with uniformed crew who vanished before takeoff. Flight attendants described conversations with men they later recognized from photographs of the crash victims. The airline publicly dismissed the stories as superstition, insisting no aircraft contained haunted parts. But whispers persisted. Some crew members refused to fly certain planes. Others insisted that Repo's ghost had once appeared in a cockpit, warning a crew about an impending malfunction, a warning that saved lives. Eventually, Eastern Airlines quietly removed salvaged parts from its fleet, and the ghost sightings subsided. The legend of Flight 401 became one of aviation's most enduring ghost stories, blending tragedy with the eerie persistence of memory. For families of the victims, the ghost tales were bittersweet. They highlighted how deeply the crash had entered cultural imagination, but also threatened to overshadow the human loss. 96 lives ended in that swamp, leaving behind widows, orphans, and communities scarred by grief. Survivors carried physical and emotional wounds for decades, remembering not only the horror of impact, but also the strange quiet of the Everglades that night, a silence broken only by cries for help and the chop of rescue helicopters. Flight 401 also left a legacy of change. Cockpit procedures were revised to prevent distraction during minor malfunctions. Crew resource management became a cornerstone of aviation training, teaching pilots to divide attention and monitor instruments even under stress. In that sense, the loss of Flight 401 reshaped aviation, ensuring safer skies for future travellers. Still, the haunting remains part of the narrative. Books, documentaries, and even television dramatizations have kept alive the stories of ghostly crew members lingering in the cabins of L1011s. Whether one believes in such tales or not, they reflect the deep imprint of the tragedy, the sense that something unfinished lingers when so many lives are cut short. Today, the crash site in the Everglades is overgrown, its wreckage long removed. But the legend of Eastern Airlines Flight 401 lives on, not only as a cautionary tale of distraction in the cockpit, but also as one of the strangest intersections of aviation and folklore. It is remembered as both a tragedy of error and a haunting, where the ghosts of a lost flight seemed unwilling to leave the skies they once commanded. December 24th, 1971, Lancer Flight 508 took off from Lima, Peru, bound for Pucallpa, a city deep in the Amazon basin. The plane, a Lockheed L188A Electra turboprop, carried 92 passengers and crew, many travelling home for the holidays. Families were in festive spirits, eager to celebrate Christmas in their hometowns. Among them was 17-year-old Julianne Koepke, flying with her mother to reunite with her father at a biological research station in the jungle. The mood on board was cheerful, the weather in Lima fair, but farther east the skies over the Andes and Amazon concealed a deadly trap. Within an hour of takeoff, the flight vanished into storm clouds. When it failed to arrive, the world would soon learn of one of aviation's strangest disasters and one of survival's most extraordinary tales. The Lockheed Electra was a proven aircraft capable of handling long domestic routes in Peru's mountainous terrain. But the Andes are notorious for sudden storms, and that day, thunderstorms towered to heights of 30,000 feet, their anvils flashing with lightning. Flight 508 pressed on through the turbulent air, passengers clutched armrests as the aircraft shook violently. Lightning illuminated the cabin, revealing anxious faces. Then disaster struck. A bolt of lightning appeared to hit the plane directly. Witnesses later reported seeing flames trailing from the wing. Almost instantly, the Electra broke apart in mid-air, fragments scattering over miles of rainforest. Amazingly, one passenger survived the fall. Still strapped into her row of seats, Julianne Koepke plummeted more than 10,000 feet into the jungle canopy. Branches and foliage cushioned her fall, and she lost consciousness. When she awoke, battered and alone, she found herself in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. Around her lay dense jungle, oppressive humidity, and the distant calls of unseen creatures. The wreckage of the Electra was nowhere in sight. Everyone else, including her mother, was gone. Julianne's survival was due in part to her upbringing. The daughter of German scientists who had studied in the Amazon for years, she had learned basic survival skills as a child. Injured and disoriented, with a broken collarbone, swollen eye, and deep cuts, she remembered her father's advice. Rivers are lifelines. Find water, follow it, and eventually it will lead to people. For 11 days she trekked through the jungle, subsisting on rainwater and what little she could scavenge. At night, she huddled under leaves to shield herself from insects and rain. Leeches clung to her skin, mosquitoes tormented her, and hunger gnawed constantly. Yet she pressed on. Meanwhile, searchers scoured the region for the missing plane. The jungle canopy was so dense that aerial searches revealed nothing. Families waited in agony, hoping for miracles but bracing for loss. As days passed, officials assumed all aboard had perished. Only when Julianne stumbled upon a logging camp emaciated and delirious did the world learn that someone had survived. Local workers cared for her until rescuers arrived. She was the sole survivor of Flight 508. The crash of LANSA, Flight 508, raised disturbing questions. Lightning strikes on planes are not unusual, and commercial aircraft are designed to withstand them. How could one bolt destroy a modern airliner? Investigators concluded that poor maintenance was partly to blame. The airline, Líneas Aéreas Nacionales S.A., LANSA, had a troubling safety record. Its fleet was aging, and reports later revealed shortcuts in inspections. The Electra that carried Flight 508 may have been structurally weakened, unable to withstand the stress of the storm. In effect, lightning triggered a catastrophe that proper oversight might have prevented. For Peru, the crash was a national tragedy. 91 lives were lost, many families destroyed on what should have been a joyous holiday. The fact that it occurred on Christmas Eve deepened the sorrow, as grieving families faced empty seats at dinner tables. For LANSA, it was the final blow. Already mistrusted, the airline collapsed soon after, its reputation undone by a string of fatal accidents. Flight 508 became the symbol of its negligence. Yet what endures most from this disaster is Julianne's survival. Her ordeal became a story of almost mythic proportions, a tale of a teenager who walked out of the jungle when no one believed survival possible. Over time, she told her story in interviews, books, and documentaries. Far from glorifying her endurance, she described the ordeal with quiet humility, crediting her parents' lessons and the will to live. Her survival inspired countless people, showing that even in the face of catastrophe, resilience is possible. For aviation historians, Flight 508 is a reminder of the hidden dangers of poor maintenance and the unpredictable power of nature. Modern planes are safer, yet the case underscores the importance of strict oversight and the fact that lightning, turbulence, and storms remain forces to be respected. For the families of the victims, however, the technical details mattered less than the raw grief of losing loved ones in such a violent, unexpected way. The wreckage of the Electra still lies scattered in the Peruvian jungle, slowly consumed by vegetation. For decades it was visited occasionally by scientists, journalists, and locals, a silent reminder of the fragility of human technology against nature's fury. Each fragment of metal is a testament to the lives lost, to the storm that claimed them, and to the one young woman who emerged from it alive. LANSA. Flight 508 stands as one of the most extraordinary stories in aviation history, not only for the mystery of how a lightning strike could bring down a modern airliner, but for the survival that followed. On the evening of October the 21st, 1978, a 20-year-old pilot named Frederick Valentich took off from Moorabbin Airport near Melbourne, Australia, on what should have been a straightforward training flight. He was flying a Cessna 182L, a single-engine light aircraft, across Bass Strait to King Island, a route familiar to many Australian pilots. The weather was clear, though twilight was deepening into night. Valentich had logged around 150 hours of flying experience, enough to be licensed, but still a novice by professional standards. His trip, routine at first glance, would become one of the most enduring mysteries in aviation history. For while the Cessna departed Moorabbin, it never reached King Island. Instead, Valentich's last minutes were preserved in a haunting radio transmission that has fueled speculation for decades. The flight began without incident. Valentich checked in with Melbourne Flight Service at 7:06 p.m, confirming his departure and intended route. His voice was steady, professional. For the next half hour, nothing unusual was reported. Then at 7:06, Valentich radioed controllers with a startling message. He had sighted an unidentified aircraft. He described it as a long metallic object with 4 bright lights. It appeared to be playing some kind of game with him, hovering above, then darting past. Controllers, puzzled, asked him to identify the craft. Valentich insisted it was not an aircraft. The exchange grew increasingly strange. Valentich reported that the object was moving at high speed, orbiting around him. He described its shiny surface and green light. His tone shifted from curiosity to unease. "It's not an aircraft," he repeated. At 7:12 p.m, his final words came across the radio. "It's hovering, and it's not an aircraft." Then a burst of metallic scraping noises filled the channel. After 17 seconds, silence. Controllers called again and again, but Valentich never responded. Search and rescue operations were launched immediately. Aircraft and ships scoured Bass Strait, covering hundreds of square miles. They expected to find wreckage floating on the waves, or at least an oil slick. Nothing was discovered. Days of searching yielded no trace of Valentich or his Cessna. It was as though the young pilot had vanished into the sky. The mystery deepened as investigators pieced together the case. Valentich had filed a proper flight plan. Weather was calm, his aircraft was fully fueled and mechanically sound. If he had suffered engine failure, he would have had time to ditch and radio a distress call. If he had become disoriented, the wreckage should still have been located. Yet the sea remained empty, and the sky offered no answers. Speculation soon spread. Some suggested Valentich had staged his disappearance, faking the UFO story as cover, but no evidence supported this, and friends described him as earnest and passionate about aviation. Others argued that he had become disoriented in the twilight, mistaking stars or reflections for a mysterious craft. Perhaps, in panic, he had lost control and plunged into the sea. Yet this explanation did not account for the strange metallic noises captured on tape. The most sensational theory, of course, was that Valentich encountered something not of this world. His description of a hovering, metallic object with green light fit popular depictions of UFOs in the 1970s. Ufologists seized on the case as proof of extraterrestrial involvement. Some claimed fishermen had seen strange lights in the sky that evening, while others reported unidentified radar blips. The Australian government investigated but offered no definitive conclusion. The official report classified the incident as missing, cause unknown. For Valentich's family, the disappearance was a wound without closure. His father insisted Frederick had been taken by a UFO, that nothing else explained the details. Skeptics countered that the young pilot, under stress or illusion, had lost control. Psychologists noted that Valentich had shown an interest in UFOs before, even discussing them with friends. Perhaps, they suggested, he misinterpreted ordinary sights through the lens of fascination. Still, the sudden ending of his transmission and the lack of wreckage kept the mystery alive. In the decades since, the Valentich case has remained one of the most discussed aviation disappearances in history. Unlike most vanishings, it is anchored by that eerie recorded exchange between pilot and controllers. It is not rumour or folklore. The words are documented, official and chilling. They place us in the cockpit with a young man who believed he was confronting something inexplicable, only to be erased moments later. Bass Strait itself has a dark reputation. Known for sudden weather shifts, powerful currents, and a history of shipwrecks, it has swallowed many vessels. Planes too have been lost there, their wrecks never found. It is entirely possible that Valentich, confused and panicked, descended into the waters and was consumed like countless others before him. But the circumstances, the calm weather, the metallic noises, the descriptions of lights keep this legend alive. What sets this case apart is the fusion of the ordinary and the extraordinary. A routine training flight, a reliable Cessna, a young pilot with modest hours, paired with a transmission describing a UFO. Unlike Amelia Earhart or Flight 19, where evidence points to navigation errors or storms, Valentich's final words place the mystery in another category altogether. They leave open the possibility, however unlikely, of something beyond human explanation. Today, the Valentich disappearance is memorialized not only in aviation records but also in cultural memory. Documentaries revisit his final transmission, UFO enthusiasts cite it as proof, skeptics dissect it for errors. Yet the core remains unresolved. A young pilot vanished, his words echoing through history. His last sentence, "It's not an aircraft," hangs in the air, a haunting testament to the unknown. The case of Frederick Valentich reminds us that the sky holds mysteries as deep as the sea. Some vanishings can be explained by weather, error, or mechanical failure. Others defy neat conclusions, leaving us to wrestle with silence and uncertainty. In 1978, over Bass Strait, a Cessna vanished into that uncertainty, carrying with it not only one young man, but also one of aviation's strangest, most enduring questions. In the early hours of March 8, 2014, Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 lifted from Kuala Lumpur bound for Beijing. The Boeing 777 carried 239 people from 14 nations, businessmen, families, honeymooners, children, on a route flown countless times before. The aircraft itself was one of the most reliable in the skies, flown by experienced Captain Zaharia Ahmad Shah and his first officer, Farik Abdul Hamid. Takeoff was smooth, the climb steady, and communication with air traffic control routine. Yet less than an hour later, as the plane crossed from Malaysian to Vietnamese airspace, it vanished from civilian radar. No distress call was made, no signal of trouble was received. A modern airliner in calm weather had disappeared. At first, confusion reigned. Vietnamese controllers expected MH370 to check in, but no contact came. Malaysian officials assumed the flight had strayed off course. Relatives in Beijing gathered at the airport, watching arrival boards that refused to update. Within hours, the reality sank in. MH370 was missing. Search operations began over the South China Sea, where the aircraft was last tracked. Naval ships and aircraft from multiple countries converged, scouring the waters, but the sea yielded nothing. No debris, no oil slick, no signal from emergency beacons. Days later, military radar revealed a startling fact. MH370 had not crashed in the South China Sea at all. Instead, it had turned sharply west, crossing the Malay Peninsula before heading into the vastness of the Indian Ocean. The plane had flown for hours after its last radio contact, tracked faintly by satellites in what came to be called handshakes, brief pings between the aircraft and an orbiting satellite. These signals suggested the 777 had continued flying south into one of the most remote regions on Earth, finally vanishing when fuel was exhausted. This revelation shifted the search from the busy waters near Vietnam to the emptiness of the southern Indian Ocean. The implications were staggering. If the plane had turned west deliberately, who had commanded it? If it had been a hijacking, why had no demands been made? If it had been mechanical failure, how had it flown silently for hours? Investigators considered scenarios ranging from pilot suicide to electrical fire to hijacking by unknown actors. Yet each theory met with contradictions. A pilot determined to take the plane down might not have flown it for hours on end. A fire might disable communications but was unlikely to allow controlled flight across thousands of miles. The lack of distress calls, in an age of constant communication, remained baffling. Families of the missing lived through agony. For weeks they gathered in hotels, clinging to news conferences where officials offered contradictory statements. Malaysian authorities struggled to coordinate the search, releasing confusing timelines and incomplete data. The uncertainty deepened the grief. For relatives, the hardest part was not knowing. Had their loved ones perished instantly? Had they suffered? Were they alive somewhere? Waiting for rescue. Each day without answers felt like a fresh wound. Over time, fragments of debris began to surface. In July 2015, more than a year after the disappearance, a flaperon, a wing component, washed ashore on Réunion Island in the Indian Ocean, thousands of miles from Malaysia. Later, other pieces were found on beaches in Madagascar, Mauritius, and Mozambique. Tests confirmed they belonged to MH370. These fragments proved the plane had indeed crashed into the Indian Ocean, but the main wreckage, and the flight recorders with it, remained hidden beneath miles of water. Despite the largest search in aviation history, covering over 120,000 square kilometers of seabed, nothing else definitive was found. The mystery of MH370 has sparked endless theories. Some believe the captain deliberately diverted the flight, perhaps as an act of protest or despair. Others argue mechanical failure or sudden decompression left the crew incapacitated, with the plane flying on autopilot until fuel ran out. Conspiracy theories abound. Hijacking, military shootdowns, secret landings. Each idea gains traction, then falters against the stubborn lack of evidence. The official investigation, released in 2018, concluded only that the plane's diversion was deliberate, but stopped short of assigning motive or blame. What makes MH370 so haunting is that it happened in an age when such disappearances should be impossible. Satellites track ships, phones ping towers, radar sweeps the skies. Yet a Boeing 777, one of the most advanced jets in service, slipped from view as completely as Amelia Earhart's Electra in 1937. The contrast between modern expectation and ancient mystery shook global confidence in aviation. If MH370 could vanish, what else was possible? The disappearance also forced changes. Airlines now track aircraft more closely, requiring more frequent position reports. New systems ensure that if a plane deviates from its path, alerts are triggered automatically. Future black boxes may be designed to stream data in real time, preventing such mysteries from recurring. These changes, however, came too late for the 239 lives aboard MH370. For families, the pain remains raw. Many continue to demand answers, pressing governments to resume the search. Memorials have been built, names engraved, but closure remains elusive. To grieve without remains, to mourn without knowing, is to live in the shadow of uncertainty. Each wave that touches the beaches of the Indian Ocean could carry a fragment of their loved one's final journey. MH370 is not just an aviation disaster. It is a reminder of how fragile certainty can be. For centuries, ships vanished into oceans, their fates unknown. The age of flight promised to end such mysteries, yet in 2014, the sky claimed another. Somewhere on the floor of the Indian Ocean, the wreck of MH370 rests, its voice recorders silent, its answers still locked away. Until it is found, the story of Flight 370 remains suspended between fact and legend. A modern ghost story written in radar pings, silence, and the endless sea. Chapter 25, Air France Flight 447, 2009. On May 31st, 2009, Air France Flight 447 departed Rio de Janeiro just after 7 p.m, bound for Paris. The aircraft, an Airbus A330, was among the most modern in the skies, piloted by a seasoned crew and carrying 216 passengers and 12 crew members. Businessmen, families, tourists, and flight attendants settled into the overnight journey, expecting to wake beneath the grey skies of France. Instead, within 4 hours, the jet vanished over the Atlantic. No distress call was made, no emergency beacon was triggered. For days, the aircraft seemed to have dissolved into the ocean, leaving only silence and speculation. It was a disappearance that shook modern aviation, echoing the mysteries of earlier eras when planes could vanish without trace. The route from Rio to Paris crossed the Intertropical Convergence Zone, a band of thunderstorms that circles the equator. These storms can tower higher than commercial jets, producing turbulence, lightning, and heavy icing. Flight 447 entered this region in the early morning hours of June 1st. At 1:35 a.m, it sent its last routine message to air traffic control. Shortly after, a series of automated data transmissions began arriving from the aircraft. Cryptic maintenance messages indicating failures in the flight control and navigation systems. At 2:14 a.m, the final transmission ceased, then nothing. Searchers scoured the Atlantic for wreckage, focusing on the area between Brazil and West Africa. Ships, planes, and satellites were deployed. At first, nothing appeared. No debris, no life rafts. Families waited in anguish, recalling other vanishings where planes had never been found. After several days, searchers located small fragments, a piece of tail fin, floating seat cushions, personal belongings. The grim evidence confirmed Flight 447 had gone down in the mid-Atlantic, but the main wreckage, and with it the flight recorders, lay in waters nearly 3 miles deep. For investigators, the disappearance raised impossible questions. How could a modern Airbus, equipped with redundant systems and flown by trained pilots, simply vanish? Was it struck by lightning? Did severe turbulence tear it apart? Did catastrophic mechanical failure bring it down? For 2 years, the answers remained hidden on the ocean floor. The world watched as each new search mission scoured the seabed with sonar, only to return empty-handed. Like MH370 years later, Flight 447 seemed fated to remain a ghost flight. Then in 2011, deep-sea search vehicles finally located the wreck. Scattered across the seabed were the remains of the Airbus, remarkably well preserved in the icy depths. Among the wreckage were the flight data recorders, the black boxes still intact. When recovered and analysed, they revealed a tragedy of human and mechanical error interwoven. The data showed that as Flight 447 entered storms, its pitot tubes, sensors that measure airspeed, became clogged with ice crystals. The autopilot, suddenly deprived of reliable airspeed data, disconnected. The aircraft shifted control back to the pilots. At first, the crew appeared uncertain. Alarms sounded, instruments contradicted one another, and in the confusion, the plane began to climb steeply. Within seconds, it entered an aerodynamic stall, a condition where wings lose lift. The nose of the jet was too high, its speed too low. The correct response would have been to push the nose down, regain speed, and recover. Instead, the pilots, perhaps misled by conflicting data, pulled back further. For the next 4 minutes, the aircraft remained in stall, engines at full thrust but wings unable to produce lift. It descended steadily until it struck the ocean at over 100 knots as all 228 aboard were killed instantly. The revelations were shocking. A stall at cruising altitude was almost unthinkable. Pilots trained for stalls at low altitude, where recovery is routine, but at 35,000 feet in darkness surrounded by storm clouds and with unreliable instruments, the crew failed to recognize the situation. The black boxes recorded their confusion, their contradictory commands, their disbelief that such a modern jet could be in a fatal stall. The ocean preserved their voices, haunting echoes of a disaster unfolding in real time. For families, the discovery brought both closure and renewed grief. Some had clung to the hope that their loved one's final moments were sudden, mercifully swift. The black box data suggested instead a slow, agonizing descent lasting several minutes, with passengers likely aware of the unfolding catastrophe. Yet the recovery also meant that answers were no longer hidden. Flight 447 would not remain a mystery like so many before. Its lessons could be studied, its failures corrected. The investigation reshaped aviation training. Airlines around the world revised stall recovery procedures, emphasizing recognition and response at high altitude. Pilots were taught to trust fundamental principles: lower the nose, add power, over confusing instrument readouts. Aircraft manufacturers improved pitot tube designs to prevent icing. Regulators demanded new standards for training and instrumentation. Out of tragedy came change, ensuring greater safety for future passengers. Yet the haunting aspect of Flight 447 lingers. For 2 years it existed as a ghost, a vanished aircraft in the middle of the modern age. Families endured uncertainty, imagining wreckage scattered across waves, waiting for word that never came. The disappearance reminded the world that even in the 21st century, the ocean can still swallow planes as easily as it swallowed ships centuries ago. Today, the story of Air France Flight 447 sits at the crossroads of mystery and resolution. Unlike Amelia Earhart or MH370, its wreck was eventually found, its causes revealed. Yet its memory retains the aura of disappearance, the haunting image of a plane vanishing into storms without a call for help. It remains a reminder of both the fragility of flight and the resilience of those who seek answers, no matter how deep the ocean hides them. Flight 447 is remembered not only as tragedy but as testimony that even the most modern aircraft can fall prey to human confusion, natural forces, and the silence of the sea. In the years following World War II, the US Air Force relied heavily on the Douglas C-124 Globemaster II, a massive 4-engine transport nicknamed Old Shaky. It was one of the largest aircraft of its era, designed to haul tanks, troops, and cargo across continents. Its cavernous interior made it indispensable during the Korean War and early Cold War years. Yet despite its size and reliability, several Globemasters vanished without a trace, swallowed by oceans and wilderness as if they were no more substantial than a small bush plane. Among the most unsettling of these disappearances was the loss of a C-124 in the early 1950s, a plane carrying more than 50 men, which simply never arrived. Its fate has never been fully explained. On March 23, 1951, a C-124 departed from McCord Air Force Base in Washington, bound for Elmendorf in Alaska. On board were 52 military personnel and crew, most of them being ferried north to support Cold War defences in the Arctic. The Globemaster was fully fueled, its engines strong, and weather across the Northwest Corridor was rough but manageable. Crews had flown this route countless times. Yet as the aircraft moved up the coast of British Columbia, it fell silent. The last radio contact reported routine progress. No distress call was ever made. When the aircraft failed to arrive at Elmendorf, the Air Force launched one of the largest search operations in North American history at the time. Over 80 planes and hundreds of ground teams scoured the rugged mountains and fjords of British Columbia and southern Alaska. The area was vast, filled with snow-covered peaks, deep valleys, and storm-lashed coastlines. For days, searchers flew grid patterns, straining to spot wreckage against white expanses, yet nothing was found. No debris, no oil slick, no survivors. For an aircraft the size of the C-124 to disappear so completely stunned investigators. Several theories emerged. Some suggested the plane had strayed off course in heavy weather and flown into mountains shrouded by cloud. If it had crashed into glacial terrain, the wreck could have been instantly buried beneath ice and snow, hidden from searchers then and perhaps forever. Others argued the aircraft may have suffered catastrophic mechanical failure, plunging into the Pacific along the stormy coastal corridor. In that case, the frigid waters would have swallowed the wreck, scattering fragments and pulling them quickly beneath the surface. But again, without evidence, these explanations remained speculative. The loss of the McCord C-124 was not isolated. In November 1952, another Globemaster vanished over the Atlantic while ferrying 53 servicemen to the Azores. It too was never recovered. In March 1953, yet another C-124 went down in the Atlantic near Ireland, carrying 53 men. Wreckage and bodies were briefly spotted, but then lost to storms before recovery could be made. Each incident deepened the sense that these enormous transports, despite their bulk, could disappear as easily as a single-engine Cessna. For the families of the missing, the disappearances left wounds that never healed. Wives received telegrams stating only that their husbands were missing in flight. Children grew up with empty chairs at the dinner table and questions without answers. Military records listed the men as presumed dead, but without remains, funerals were symbolic. In towns across America, flag-draped memorials replaced graves. The Air Force, under pressure, reviewed the Globemaster's record. The C-124 was a robust aircraft, but like all piston-engine transports of the era, it faced challenges: mechanical complexity, limited navigation aids, and dependence on weather forecasts that were often unreliable in polar and oceanic regions. Flying the Great Circle routes over Alaska, Canada, and the Atlantic pushed both machine and crew to the limit. A single error in navigation, a storm stronger than expected, or an engine failure at the wrong time could spell disaster. What haunts these cases is not only the loss of life, but the complete absence of wreckage. Even when aircraft strike remote terrain, some trace is usually found. That nothing surfaced in multiple C-124 disappearances suggested that nature itself conspired to conceal them. Mountains and glaciers swallowing evidence, oceans scattering debris beyond reach. For investigators, the silence of absence was maddening. For families, it was unbearable. The missing Globemaster flights became part of Cold War aviation lore, whispered among pilots and ground crews. Men preparing to fly the same routes sometimes spoke of them as the cursed corridors, paths where planes the size of houses could simply vanish. Officially, the disappearances were written off as accidents caused by weather or mechanical failure. Unofficially, they became ghost stories, reminders that in the age of massive transports and global reach, the sky still held mysteries. Decades later, small fragments of answers have occasionally surfaced. In Alaska, hikers and bush pilots have stumbled across unidentified wreckage, sometimes half buried in ice. Some believe these could be remnants of the lost McCord Globemaster. In the Atlantic, fishing vessels have snagged twisted metal in their nets, only to discard it when they realized it was too large to retrieve. None of these discoveries have ever been conclusively tied to the missing C-124s. The official records remain unchanged. Missing, presumed lost. The Globemaster disappearances highlight a truth that runs throughout aviation history. Size is no safeguard against mystery. The DC-3, the Boeing 777, the Airbus A330, all have vanished as completely as the smallest single-engine craft. The Amazon basin is one of the most dangerous places in the world to fly. It is a landscape of extremes, endless jungles stretching to the horizon, rivers as wide as seas, thunderstorms that rise like mountains, and humidity that corrodes machines as surely as it drains men. For decades, bush pilots have threaded its skies in small aircraft, Cessnas, Pipers, and Beechcrafts, bringing medicine, food, missionaries, scientists, and supplies to isolated communities. Yet these flights are perilous. When a small plane goes down in the Amazon, the chances of discovery are slim. The canopy swallows wreckage, the rivers carry it away, and the forest reclaims it within days. Many aircraft have disappeared here, their stories passed on as legends among pilots and villagers, their remains never recovered. The Cessna 210, 182 and 206 have long been staples of jungle flying. Rugged, relatively simple and able to land on short airstrips or riverbanks, they became lifelines for remote tribes and settlers, but their very ubiquity makes their losses more frequent. Weather is often the culprit. The Amazon storms are unlike those in temperate skies. Towering cumulonimbus clouds that grow in minutes, producing walls of rain and lightning, downdrafts that can slam a plane into the forest before a pilot can react. In regions where radar coverage is absent and radio unreliable, a Cessna caught in such a storm may vanish without even a distress call. One of the most haunting cases occurred in 1976, when a missionary pilot flying a Cessna 206 with 5 passengers failed to arrive at a remote outpost in Brazil. The route was only 90 miles, over dense but navigable forest. Search planes scoured the area for weeks, flying low and slow, peering down through breaks in the canopy. Nothing was found. Locals whispered that the plane had been swallowed by the green ocean, as they called the forest. Decades later, a hunter stumbled across a fragment of aluminum deep in the jungle, but no bodies were ever identified. For the families, the loss became a wound that never closed, a reminder that the Amazon could erase a machine as easily as it erased footprints in mud. Another disappearance struck in 2009 when a Cessna Caravan operated by a regional airline went missing on a flight from Cruzeiro do Sul to Manaus, carrying cargo and a handful of passengers. Modern technology, including emergency locator transmitters, should have pinpointed the wreck. Yet no signal was ever received. Days of searching turned up nothing. Villagers along remote rivers claimed to have heard engines sputtering overhead before silence. But investigators could not confirm. To this day, no trace of that caravan has been recovered. The reasons for such disappearances are rooted in geography as much as weather. The Amazon canopy is a dense green shield, hundreds of feet thick. A plane that crashes into it may be caught in branches and hidden from sight, its wreckage invisible even to searchers flying directly overhead. Rivers present another danger. A small aircraft ditching in muddy water can sink within minutes, its cargo and passengers pulled under, its remains lost in shifting currents. Even when wrecks are found, recovery is difficult. Roads are few, helicopters scarce, and the jungle quickly reclaims what falls into it. For the people who live in the Amazon, such losses are part of life. Villages sometimes erect crosses along riverbanks to honour those who vanished. Families in Manaus, Iquitos or Belém still tell stories of relatives who boarded a small plane and never returned. The absence of closure weighs heavily. Without wreckage, without remains, grief becomes a kind of limbo. Some cling to hope that their loved ones might have survived, wandering in the forest. Others resign themselves to the idea that the jungle has claimed them, their final resting place known only to trees and rivers. For pilots, the disappearances are cautionary tales. Bush flying in the Amazon requires respect for weather, patience, and an intimate knowledge of the land. Veterans warn newcomers never to push through a storm, never to underestimate the distances, never to assume radio contact will be reliable. They carry machetes and survival kits in case of a crash, knowing rescue might not come. Still, even the most careful can fall victim. Mechanical failure, fuel miscalculation, or a sudden wall of rain can erase skill in an instant. The disappearances of Cessnas over the Amazon may not command global headlines like the loss of a Boeing 777, but they are tragedies of equal weight to the families involved. Each vanished plane represents lives interrupted, communities cut off, and stories left unfinished. Together they form a shadow history of aviation in the region, one written not in official reports but in memories, rumours, and the silence of the jungle. What makes these vanishings so haunting is their scale. A small plane seems almost trivial against the immensity of the Amazon. Yet for those aboard, that plane was the centre of the world, their lifeline across a wilderness that cannot be walked. When it vanishes, it is not simply a machine lost, but human lives reduced to whispers in the trees. Unlike oceans, which sometimes return fragments to shore, the jungle keeps its secrets, metal corrodes, vines tighten, animals scatter remains. Within a year, even a fuselage can become invisible beneath moss and foliage. The Amazon is often called the lungs of the earth, a place of life and abundance. Yet for pilots and passengers who vanish within it, it becomes a tomb as complete as any ocean trench. Each missing Cessna adds to the legend of the Green Abyss, a reminder that human technology is fragile before nature's scale. And somewhere, scattered across thousands of miles of jungle, dozens of these aircraft still lie, their aluminum bones entangled in roots, their stories silent, their passengers remembered only by those still waiting for answers. The Cessnas of the Amazon remind us that disappearance is not limited to high-tech jets or wartime transports. It can happen in the humblest of flights, on routes measured in minutes, under skies crossed by birds and insects. The jungle does not discriminate. It takes without leaving trace, binding aircraft and lives alike into its endless canopy. And as long as people fly its skies, the Amazon will continue to be both a lifeline and a labyrinth, a place where planes depart with confidence but sometimes never arrive. Across the vastness of the Pacific Ocean runs an invisible highway, air routes connecting the scattered islands of Micronesia and Polynesia to larger hubs in Asia and the Americas. For decades, these routes have been lifelines for tiny atolls and remote outposts. Yet the Pacific, larger than all the world's continents combined, is also a graveyard. Its silence is absolute. When an aircraft strays off course, the distances are so great, the islands so few that recovery is nearly impossible. Over the years, numerous planes, small island hoppers and larger transports alike, have disappeared into this corridor, their fates never confirmed, their stories preserved only in fragments of rumour and silence. The challenges of flying here are immense. Pilots cross thousands of miles of empty ocean with only scattered islands as waypoints. Weather can change abruptly. Towering thunderheads erupt from the sea, typhoons sweep across routes, and crosswinds blow aircraft far off course. Navigation, especially before the advent of GPS, was precarious. A few minutes of error could mean missing an island completely, and over the Pacific there is no second chance. A missed landing strip is not an inconvenience but a death sentence. Many aircraft that vanished here were never found, their wreckage swallowed by deep trenches miles below the surface. One of the earliest and most famous disappearances was that of Pan Am Flight 7 in 1957, which vanished en route to Honolulu. But beyond the high-profile cases were dozens of smaller flights, often carrying missionaries, traders, or soldiers between island chains. In the 1960s and 1970s, several C-47s, DC-3s, and small Cessnas vanished on flights linking Guam, Yap, Truk, and Palau. These were not headline-making events in the wider world, but for the communities involved they were devastating. Entire families were lost, their absence leaving empty houses on islands where every life was intertwined with the survival of the community. The isolation of the Pacific made searches almost hopeless. When a plane went down between islands, the search radius could be hundreds of miles. Fuel limits meant aircraft could only remain on station for a short time before turning back. Ships trawled the seas, but unless wreckage floated, and unless searchers were in the right place at the right time, it was never spotted. Currents carried debris away in days. Unlike in the Atlantic, where coastlines could eventually trap wreckage, the Pacific offered no such mercy. Once gone, planes disappeared into silence. Perhaps the most chilling aspect of the Pacific's silent corridor is how ordinary the disappearances often were. Pilots radioed routine reports, fuel status normal, weather manageable, course steady, then nothing. Radios went quiet and aircraft failed to arrive. In some cases, their last words hinted at trouble. Confusion over bearings, sudden storms, or fuel concerns. In others, the silence was absolute, as if the plane had been plucked from the sky. For families, the lack of wreckage meant the lack of closure. Loved ones became names on lists, memorialized without graves. The Cold War added another layer of mystery. The Pacific was a theater of military traffic. American, Soviet, and Japanese patrols crisscrossed the region, and secrecy often cloaked losses. US military transports occasionally vanished on long-haul flights between Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii. Some were later quietly confirmed as crashes, others remained unexplained. Soviet aircraft too were rumoured to have gone missing in the far northern Pacific, though official acknowledgement was rare. In the tense climate of the era, disappearances could be misinterpreted as espionage or hostile action, fueling speculation but leaving little truth available. One case that has lingered in regional memory is the 1963 disappearance of a US Navy transport carrying more than 20 men between Guam and the Philippines. Radio contacts ceased mid-flight and a massive search found only a thin oil slick. The aircraft and its passengers were never recovered. Locals across Micronesia still tell of seeing lights in the sky that night, some claiming the plane burned before vanishing into the ocean. The Navy's official report listed the cause as unknown, the final entry in a file that closed without resolution. For island communities, these vanishings were personal. The Pacific is not an abstract map here, but home, and every disappearance left ripples across generations. Children grew up without fathers, villages lost leaders, teachers, or priests. In some traditions, families lit lanterns and set them adrift on the sea, symbolic guides for lost souls. On isolated atolls, people still point to stretches of horizon and say, "That is where the plane went down." The silence of the ocean has become part of their oral history, a reminder that the sky can take as much as it gives. Even in modern times, the corridor has claimed lives. Small aircraft continue to ferry supplies and passengers between islands. In 2016, a Cessna vanished on a short flight in Micronesia, its wreckage never located. Satellites and GPS have improved safety, but the ocean remains vast and merciless. Once a plane slips beneath its surface, recovery is still nearly impossible. The Pacific's silent corridor is not marked on maps, but pilots know it by instinct. It is the space between dots, the emptiness that lies beneath their wings for hour after hour. To fly, it is to trust entirely in engines, instruments, and skill. To vanish in it is to be erased almost completely. The ocean does not return secrets here. It buries them beneath trenches deeper than Everest is tall, keeping them forever in darkness. In the long record of aviation disappearances, the Pacific's silent corridor represents the enduring power of nature over human ambition. Its disappearances may not all be famous, but they are many, and together they form a haunting chorus. Each missing aircraft is a reminder that in this vast expanse, silence rules. Planes depart, voices crackle over radios, families wait on distant shores, and sometimes nothing arrives but silence, stretching endlessly across the horizon. For most of aviation history, a missing plane was an open wound that could linger for decades. Families mourned without remains, investigators guessed without evidence, and the public spun tales of curses, anomalies, or supernatural forces. Yet as the 20th century gave way to the 21st, technology promised something different. Satellites circled the globe, sonar probed the ocean floor, drones swept the skies, and computers crunched vast amounts of data. The era of mysteries, it seemed, should have ended, and yet despite these advances, the ghosts of the past remain stubborn. Planes vanish, searches fail, and technology finds itself humbled by the same forces that once baffled searchers with little more than binoculars and compasses. The most dramatic example in recent memory is Malaysia Airlines Flight 370. In 2014, a Boeing 777 with 239 people aboard disappeared in one of the most closely monitored regions of global aviation. The loss was not in the 1930s, when radios were weak and navigation crude. It was in the era of smartphones, satellites, and real-time air traffic control. Despite the largest and most expensive search in aviation history, the wreckage has never been fully located. A handful of fragments washed ashore, but the aircraft itself remains hidden. If a modern jet tracked by radar and satellites can vanish so completely, what hope is there of solving mysteries that are decades older? Still, technology has delivered breakthroughs. The recovery of Air France Flight 447 in 2011 demonstrated the power of persistence combined with innovation. That Airbus A330 vanished in 2009 over the Atlantic, its wreckage resting nearly 3 miles below the surface. For 2 years, searchers failed to locate it, the black boxes thought lost forever. Then, using deep-sea robotic vehicles capable of scanning vast areas of seabed, investigators finally discovered the fuselage, largely intact, and retrieved the flight recorders. The lessons from A447 reshaped aviation training worldwide. In this case, technology reached into the depths of the ocean and pulled answers from silence. Sonar has become one of the most powerful tools in the search for vanished aircraft. From side-scan sonar to multi-beam systems, it can map the seafloor in exquisite detail, identifying wreckage and terrain more alien than the moon. But sonar has limits. The ocean is vast, currents scatter debris, and the seafloor is filled with ridges, canyons, and geological clutter that can disguise wreckage. The search for MH370 mapped thousands of square miles of previously uncharted seabed, producing valuable data for science but no closure for families. Technology illuminated the ocean, but the plane remained hidden. Satellites too offer promise and frustration. They monitor weather, track ships, and scan the globe continuously. Yet they are not designed to pinpoint small fragments of wreckage or track planes in real time. The handshakes that provided the only clues to MH370's final flight path came not from active tracking but from background communications data, essentially accidental evidence. In other cases, satellites have spotted oil slicks or debris fields that narrowed search zones. But they are fallible. Clouds obscure views, oceans move wreckage swiftly, and signals are often ambiguous. Closer to the surface, drones and small autonomous vehicles have revolutionized searches over land. They can sweep mountain ranges, tundras, and forests where manned aircraft once struggled. High-resolution cameras and infrared sensors allow them to detect wreckage hidden beneath tree cover or snow in Alaska, Canada, and the Andes. Drones have uncovered crash sites decades old, finally providing closure to families. Yet even here, success is not guaranteed. Vast forests conceal aluminum as easily as they conceal animals. Snow and ice bury wrecks for generations, sometimes releasing them only when glaciers retreat. Modern databases and artificial intelligence now help coordinate searches. By analysing historic flight paths, weather data, and last known positions, AI can generate probabilities of where a missing plane might lie. This technique has guided recent expeditions in the Pacific and Indian Oceans. Still, probability is not certainty. Families wait while algorithms argue with the silence of nature. Perhaps the most striking truth is that despite technology's leaps, the ocean and wilderness remain overwhelming. The sea is too deep, the forest too dense, the ice too thick. Technology can narrow the search, illuminate possibilities, and even recover fragments, but it cannot yet guarantee answers. The ghosts of aviation, Amelia Earhart Flight 19, the DC-3 over Puerto Rico, the C-124 Globemaster, remain unsolved not because no one cares, but because the Earth itself has hidden them too well. From the earliest days of aviation to the present age of satellites and supersonic jets, one theme has persisted. The sky does not always return what it takes. Planes vanish, leaving behind silence, families waiting, and investigators grappling with fragments of evidence that never add up to certainty. Across oceans, mountains, jungles, and frozen tundras, the pattern has repeated. Amelia Earhart over the Pacific, Flight 19 in the Bermuda Triangle, Northwest Flight 2501 over Lake Michigan, the DC-3 near Miami, and even Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 in our own century, all of them swallowed, all of them reminders that flight, though miraculous, remains fragile before the vastness of nature. These disappearances endure not simply as accidents but as mysteries, stories that grow darker and more powerful with each year of unanswered questions. What makes these vanishings so haunting is not only the loss of life, but the way they challenge our expectations. The modern world is built on the assumption of certainty. Ships may sink, but their wrecks are charted. Cars may crash, but their remains are recovered. Aircraft, by contrast, seem immune to such guarantees. Despite radar, radios, black boxes, satellites, and sonar, planes can still evaporate into absence. In a world wired by technology, their disappearance feels almost supernatural. The absence itself becomes evidence of something uncanny, a reminder that human mastery of the skies is never complete. For families, the disappearance of a flight is not just tragedy but purgatory. Without bodies to bury, without wreckage to touch, grief cannot settle. Loved ones exist in a limbo of possibilities. Perhaps the plane crashed quickly, perhaps survivors struggled, perhaps, against all reason, someone lived. Each theory offers both pain and hope, and both linger. That is why families of the missing often campaign for decades, pressing governments to resume searches long after officials have given up. They are not driven by statistics but by the need for answers, for the certainty denied to them. Investigators too are haunted. Each unresolved case becomes a shadow in the record, a reminder of limits. For every Air France 447 where black boxes are recovered years later, there are many more like MH370, where billion-dollar searches end in nothing. Pilots and crews study these disappearances not just as history, but as warnings. They remind each new generation that no matter how advanced the aircraft, no matter how skilled the crew, there will always be conditions, storms, mechanical failures, human errors that can overwhelm them. The cultural response to these mysteries has been as enduring as the tragedies themselves. Books, documentaries, and films return again and again to vanished flights, weaving tales of sabotage, espionage, or even extraterrestrial intervention. Legends like the Bermuda Triangle thrive not because they are supported by evidence, but because they answer the unbearable silence with story. Human beings cannot abide absence. We fill the void with explanations, however improbable. And so ghost stories grow around wreckage that never surfaces, myths bloom where facts are absent, and the skies become populated with legends as well as planes. Yet beneath the legends lies a harder truth. Disappearances endure because of the scale of the Earth itself.